I am really grateful to be here today, although it's no hardship leaving Wisconsin to come to Alabama in the wintertime. Tell people it's about 25 below zero yesterday morning when I left. And I got to the Atlanta airport, and it was 50 degrees in Atlanta, and everybody was freezing to death. They had the heat was cranked up to 60 degrees. So, yeah, and it's that the beard, I tell my people all the time, this beard, it's not a fashion statement, it's a survival technique in Wisconsin. And as soon as it gets over 40 degrees, which will probably not until July, my wife's going to shave it off. So she's ready for that to happen. But I'm really grateful to be here. I have given over 350 talks on Common Core in 40 states. I have testified before 15 different state legislatures. I've been invited to testify by Democrat groups, Republican groups, teachers groups, teacher union organizations, Tea Parties, in other words, the entire gamut of people. I've spoken in black churches in now Montgomery, and then in places like Harlem. I've talked in Jewish temples in places like Brooklyn. I have given talks to various Christian and Catholic groups. I've talked to more than 100 Roman Catholic priests and about 50 Roman Catholic bishops across the country about the problem of Common Core in Catholic schools. I have, on a small level, written standards, help write standards in English for the state of Texas. So I have a lot of experience with that as well. I've done a lot of this. And the thing that I am most gratified about is, since the last time I was here in Alabama, most everything what we said about Common Core is true. And with every month that goes by, more information comes out to prove that the critics of Common Core are right. And I'm going to show you all that information. The other thing I want to say here is every single piece of information you're going to see today is documented. As a university professor, I can't just say something if it's not true. And so every piece of information is documented. I will give it to you for free. At the end of the talk, I'll put a website up. You email me at that website. No one's going to ask you for money. No one's going to put you on a mailing list. You send me an email. I will send you my entire slide presentation, including the videos. You can have all of it. You should take it. And you should verify that I'm telling the truth. 350 talks. Nobody, not one time, has anybody come back to me and said the information I present is incorrect. Nobody. If you find something wrong, you go ahead and email me. Take the information and verify it. And if what I'm telling you is the truth, then I have one request of you. You hold accountable the people who support Common Core to the same standard. When you get the occasional teacher, they come out every now and then. It's easy to be a teacher who supports Common Core because your state took it, your educational administrators want it. So to be a teacher who supports it is to get the carrot, is to get patted on the head. What's hard to be is a teacher who doesn't support it. And in my 40 states, I've encountered about 10,000 of them who tell me things like, if I get seen at your talk, I might lose my job. If I get told by teachers, I really hate this, but I'm not allowed to speak about it, right? Their jobs are threatened. What kind of a system is it? Whatever you think about Common Core before we begin, what kind of a system is it that requires that kind of uniformity? In those states, much more progressive states than Alabama, in those states, where the teachers' unions have balked on Common Core, teachers are speaking out by the tens of thousands. New York State Teachers Union pulled out of Common Core, demanded it go away. And so guess what? Now New York State teachers, by 7 out of 10 New York State teachers now are speaking out against Common Core. They don't like it. But they're free to do it now because the union pulled out, which means if the state tried to fire them for their opposition to Common Core, the union in New York would have their back. I'm going to show you all the evidence for this moving forward. But you can have all this information. The people who support Common Core don't do it with evidence. When they tell you, how many of you have heard from Common Core advocates that it's rigorous? Oh, yes, of course you have. How can you possibly know it when it's just now being tested for the first time? How do they look you in the eye and say something that's never been done before is rigorous when you haven't even had Alabama, your first big state test yet? But for 4 years, they've been telling you how much more rigorous this is. Ask them to prove that. There's nothing they tell you about Common Core that they can prove. I'll prove everything I'm going to say to you today. You have to hold them to the same standard. The Common Core talking points are so transparent, as you'll see here momentarily. This is a big deal. They did this without asking you. At the national level and at the state level, they took this without consulting you, your schools, your legislature. They took it. It shouldn't be our responsibility to prove them wrong. It should be their responsibility to justify what they've done, and they won't do it. You know, for every one of these, you got hundreds of really good activists in this state. You got Amy, you got Ann, you got Diane Cruz over in Montgomery. You got people doing this work spending a lot of time. I should be home in the frozen tundra with my wife and my dogs. But the fact is that the people who support Common Core, they won't get up here and do this for you. You know how many times we've asked them to debate? You know how many times we've begged them to come out and stand alongside of us and present their case and we'll present ours? I'd love to listen to anybody present a compelling case for Common Core, but they really don't do it, do they? Where can you go in Birmingham? Where can you go in Alabama to hear the articulate case made for Common Core? And the answer is you really can't. Your schools have a policy, right, that they won't talk to you in groups about Common Core. They drag you into the principal's office, mom and dad, one by one, and tell you that you're the only ones who hate Common Core. Everybody else loves it. And how many moms and dads have told me, and they start to compare notes, moms and dads aren't as stupid as they think you are. You compare notes, right? You're told by your principal that you're the only person who's complained about this. Our teachers and our students love this. And then you start to compare notes. And you see the Alinskyite methodology of divide and conquer, right? This program's got a lot of problems. And the last thing I want to say by way of introduction is, this is not a Democrat issue. It's not a Republican issue. This is not a partisan issue, right? One of the only ways the defenders of Common Core attack talks by people like me and thousands others is to simply remark that, well, if you oppose Common Core, you're a tinfoil hat, teabagging right-winger, right? Any of you encountered that argument? Of course you have. That's not an argument, that's an insult. And the insults don't bother me, but it's not an argument. And when the entire strategy of the opposition is divide and conquer parents and slander the people who do the talking and not engaging the information, well, that says a lot before we even get started, because that's what's happening. Having said that, this is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. It's a political class versus the rest of us issue. That small group of politicians and educational administrators who think the federal government knows better than you do. This move to federalization and standardization and nationalization. And as we've seen over the last 30, 40 years, that includes a lot of Republicans. Hey, you're a Republican state, right? And I'm going to tell you honestly, in my 40 states, the Republicans have been the biggest problem on this. The Democrats want it. Why wouldn't they? It's larger government, it's more centralized control, it's top-down. Much of that fits seamlessly into the Democrat platform. But you know what you don't hear? You don't hear Democrats across the country arguing for it. Name one Democrat governor that you can think of who's been on TV advertising Common Core. They keep their mouths shut. They don't push it. They want it, but they don't push it. You know who talks about it? Jeb Bush talks about it. John Kasich talks about it. Chris Christie talks about it. And they mock and malign the people who oppose it. You have Republican control of the governorship, and we've already seen, right? I watch Alabama. Because you know why I watch Alabama, and I'm happy to come down here as much as I do? Because you're a state that shouldn't have this. I get why New York's got it. I completely understand why California has it. The fact that you have it with the kind of Republican control you have is an absurdity. And as you saw with your governor, right? They tell you, and I heard this in every state I've been to, elect us, put us back in power, Wisconsin. I've got arguably the most conservative governor in the country in Scott Walker, and I love him, but on this issue, he's been a disaster. On this issue, he's been a disaster. Unlike the Christies and the Bushes, he's not out, and the Kasichs, he's not out there telling you why you're a moron if you don't want it. Wisconsin took Common Core before he became governor. He didn't ask for it. But we gave him a supermajority in the Assembly and a Republican Senate. And he's the one stopping Common Core from being gotten rid of because he wants to go to Washington. And everybody in Washington, that's the political class thing, right? Everybody in Washington wants this. So he's not going to get rid of it and have to fight that battle. Look, 95% of the time, love the man. I would vote for him. But on this issue, he's been as bad as the others, not quite as bad. And why do I say it's a Republican problem? Because Republicans control a solid majority of state legislatures in this country. It's the state that has the ability to remove this, and they're not doing it. So just please keep that in mind. Last comment then, not only is this talk not anti-teacher, I think the only way you can possibly be pro-teacher is to be against Common Core. And I will explain and show slides why I think that's true. To be anti-Common Core is to be squarely on the side of teachers, and I will show you that too. Okay. Let's start broadly then. What is Common Core? Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards for English and math with science guidelines forthcoming. In fact, it is the aim of the Common Core people to link up every aspect of your children's curriculum every single subject area, every single grade level, from kindergarten through high school with national standards. That's the objective. Oh, and Alabama, you're like all the other states. Your state formally accepted English and math. You did not formally accept anything else. And yet, nonetheless, the other standards are being fed into your schools already. Nobody consulted you on that. I understand how you got English and math, but technically the feds, or the people in charge of Common Core, should have come back to you and said, okay, you took those, do you want the others? You have no say in this. And that's another thing to think about. Common Core is branding so badly, the words Common Core. A recent Gallup poll, and this is unbelievable given 2 years ago, 17% of American moms and dads support Common Core. That's it. Down from 47% the year ago, down from 70% 3 years ago. 17% of moms and dads. People who weren't consulted. So Common Core is branding so badly at the national level, what have they done? They've changed the name of the forthcoming new standards. You don't like Common Core, so we'll just call them something else, right? Like in Florida, they rebranded Common Core Sunshine State Standards. You've got a name for them here, all right? I forget what it is off the top of my head. Change the names and people will stop paying attention. So the new science standards that are now being fed into schools all across the country now, without ever having checked that with legislatures, those are the next generation science standards. All right? So people hear that, well, at least we don't have Common Core science. Of course you do. And I think before we even begin to look at the standards, the first part of the talk is why we're here. The second part of the talk is taking a look at the standards themselves. But I think it really matters. Even if you think you like the standards, how do we accept the way they were put in the schools? How do we accept the way this was done? Even if you think you like the standards. But they called them the Common Core State Standards Initiative. Why do they call them that? It implies, doesn't it, that the states had a lead role to play in the standards, but they didn't. And I'll show you that as we move forward. The states did not have a lead role in the creation of the standards. In most states of the Union, teachers in those states only got to see the standards after your state had accepted them. And when teachers in your state got to see the standards, they couldn't change them, edit them, reject them, alter them. It was a done deal. It was fait accompli. The idea somehow that Common Core came to your state, the teachers all looked at it or participated in it is absurd. Your state took it, which means your teachers had to take it. That was it. They have no ability to change or alter them. Why do they call them the state standards? Probably for the same reason they call Obamacare the Affordable Care Act. Did anybody actually believe it was affordable? Or do they believe it now? But whenever big government status types accrue more power that way, they give it names. I guarantee you, if you manage to kill off Common Core in Alabama, they're just going to run it back out under a different name in 3 years. They'll call it something like Happy, Happy, Joy, Joy Education. And then when you object to it, they'll say, see, you right-wingers, you hate joy. How could you be against happiness? The whole thing is a scam and a lie, and I'll show you that. Why? Before we even start here, why are they naming them things that they're not? Because it's all a big bait and switch. There is no transparency here. No state legislatures were asked to vote about this before they took them. No, even the governors, by the way, most state governors didn't accept Common Core. It was Department of Ed people like Tommy Bice, right? Or in my state, Tony Evers, who did the major work in just bringing this to the state by accepting race to the top money. No moms and dads ever had a vote on this. Teachers unions had no vote on this. Say what you will about the health care law. It at least had a hearing before the Senate, the Congress, the Supreme Court. Common Core is every bit as transformational as those things, and it had no such hearing anywhere. And yet they call them the state standards. Well, who wrote them? Where'd they come from? Didn't come from the states. They came from two Washington lobbyist groups, the National Governors Association and the CCSSO, the Council of Chief State School Officers. Now, I know what you're thinking. When you hear the name National Governors Association, well, there you go, Pesta, right? That means that's what they'll tell you. That's why it's state-led. Because the governors did it. Wait a second. Go to the NGA website. It's a lobbying group. It is not a group of governors writing policy. And you know what? I kind of wish 50 state governors locked themselves in a room and banged out education standards. Now, why do I wish that, given what qualifies your governor to write education standards? What qualifies my governor to write education standards? There's not a governor in this country who has the slightest experience, couldn't do it. Why do I wish they had done it? because you can always unelect a governor. If the governors had done this, then you have some democratic redress, don't you? The governors didn't do it. I'll tell you how I know the governors didn't do it. Does anybody who know who was the chair of which governor was the chair of the NGA during the critical point of time where Common Core was being put in the states? That was Governor Mary Fallin of Oklahoma. And about a year ago, Mary Fallin pulled Oklahoma completely out of Common Core, the chair of the NGA. And you know why she said she did it? Because the states weren't consulted. So go ahead and pretend that the NGA means the governors, and the governors did this. Do you really want your governor writing education standards? I don't want mine either. But that didn't happen. You got these two Washington lobbyist groups who wrote the standards behind closed doors. And I know some of you are taking notes. Here's a name. Whatever I don't document, I'll tell you where you can find it. Go look up Joy Pullman, Pullman. Joy has written a definitive article on the 5 people who wrote Common Core. Oh, they had help, lower level help, but there are 5 individuals in charge of Common Core, 5. Chief among them is a man by the name of David Coleman, Coleman. The liberal Huffington Post calls David Coleman the most powerful educational administrator that nobody has ever heard of. David Coleman is the architect of Common Core. Go to his Wikipedia page. He's quite proud of it. He brags about it. David Coleman has never been a classroom teacher. David Coleman has never been an educator. David Coleman has no formal educational training. He's the guy who wrote your standards, right? Got the Wikipedia page right there.
That's the State Standards Initiative.
Right? It calls them the State Standards Initiative. You're absolutely right. I understand why they do use those words. The point is it true? David Coleman, the architect of Common Core. And here's something that you're going to love. No sooner did David Coleman oversee, and we'll meet him a little bit later. No sooner did David Coleman oversee the writing of the standards than he immediately left Common Core, and by some miraculous fiat, he became the president of the college boards, where the same man who wrote these standards is now rewriting tests like the SAT to conform to his Common Core standards. Even if you think you like Common Core, how do you countenance this? The same unelected, unheard of, unaccountable to you and me bureaucrat who was allowed to oversee the writing of the standards is now transforming the exams your kids have to take to get into college to his standards. That, my friends, is banana republic stuff. That should not happen in a constitutional republic. You see why I want the governors to have done it, even though that would have been a nightmare? You don't believe me on this. How is it state-led? Please tell me how it's state-led. When the people who own the copyright for the transformational education standards that are rewriting American education aren't the states. There's your copyright. The NGA, notice it's the NGA Center, by the way. This isn't the governors. The NGA Center and the CCSSO shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and developers of the Common Core state standards, and no claims to the contrary shall be made. That means, Alabama, when people in your state tell you that it's state-led, they're violating the copyright of Common Core. When Mr. Bice tells you that Common Core is a state-led initiative, the copyright tells him he's a liar. No claims to the contrary shall be made. Your states didn't write it. This is not state-led. And yet that is one of the chief arguments, one of the only arguments you get from the supporters of Common Core. These 2 Washington lobbyist groups. So go back, who paid for it? If 5 individuals and 2 Washington lobbyist groups are the main movers of Common Core, who paid for it? Well, let's go back to 2007 and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And can I also ask you this? What qualifies Bill Gates to be involved at this level? What are his educational credentials? Exactly. Isn't he the guy that dropped out of college? And good for him. He found it utterly worthless. 22 years in academia, I'm beginning to see the light on that too, right? I get it. But here's a guy, and unlike me, who has nothing else I can do, he dropped out of college, opened a business in a garage, and made $1 billion. Good for him. The fact remains, other than his bank account, what qualifies him to do this? What qualifies David Coleman? Your Secretary of Education in Washington, D.C., the chief educational officer of the country, Arne Duncan, he's never been a classroom teacher. You know what his degrees are in? Sociology. See, and I think that's telling. The chief educational officer in the country is not an educator. He's a sociologist. And I'm going to tell you right now, Common Core is not primarily an educational program. It is a sociological one. It is not about educating your kids better, more efficiently, and more effectively. It's about sociologizing their education. It's about turning them into the kind of people the state wants them to be. It's not about allowing your kids to excel. I'll show you that too before we're done. 5 individuals, 2 Washington lobbyist groups. As you and I sit here today, Bill Gates has spent over $6 billion of his own money propagandizing for Common Core, advertising for it, greasing the skids in states to take it. There's not a single major educational organization in this country that supports Common Core that was not paid by Gates to do so. Before the standards were even written, before anybody had seen them, Gates had written multiple million-dollar checks to the National Parent-Teachers Association. You know, the PTA who's looking after your kids. Before they'd ever seen the standards, they had taken millions of dollars from Gates and had begun advertising Common Core across the country. Why did 170 Roman Catholic diocese schools take Common Core the very first year they could without even being asked to by the federal government? Well, what could it be that the NCEA, the National Catholic Education Association, the chief watchdog, the PTA of Catholic schools, they received hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants from Bill and Melinda Gates. And think about that for your Catholic schools. Bill Gates is paying Catholic schools to put Common Core in, paying them. The same Bill, you know what the only thing Bill Gates has spent more of his money on than Common Core? Abortion, eugenics, and population control in Africa. How do our Catholic schools, I guess when money's involved, principles get compromised. Hello, Governor of Alabama. Right? Hello, Governor Walker, when it comes to this stuff. So you got 2 individuals, 5 Washington lobbyist groups, Bill Gates paying everybody. As a matter of fact, there's only one non-liberal think tank that supports Common Core, and that's the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. And so, not surprisingly, they're constantly dragging out Fordham people to talk about how wonderful Common Core is. What they never tell you, $4 million over the last 2 years of Gates' money went to the Fordham people. You cannot find any serious educational organization that supports it that wasn't paid to by Gates. And you can go find this out easily enough. Because the Gates Foundation is a public charitable trust, you get to see everywhere they spent their money. You'll blow you away who they're spending money on. Right? So that's it. All right, so okay. All right, now and they don't even argue this anymore. They don't even argue this. When you go to your schools, your superintendents, when you sit down with a politician and say, hey, do you understand how we got this? The response is always, they're just a set of standards. Can we talk about the standards? Show me something in the standards you don't like. Every now and then I'll get some teachers who'll show up at my talks and they'll flip over their computer. They're all on edge, and they'll have the standards called up in front of them, right? You're going to see before this is all said and done that you cannot possibly look at them as just an independent set of standards. And I'll make that case, right? It happens all the time. But there's no really answer to this. They don't want to talk about this. But I get what you're thinking. Okay, all right, even if this is true, how do you argue it's federal then? 2 Washington lobbyist groups, 5 unelected individuals, a billionaire. How's it federal? I don't care how much money Bill Gates has. He could not have put this in American public schools if the federal government didn't want him to. You've been paying attention to the federal government of the United States for the last 40 years. This is a federal government that doesn't like you doing what it does. It spent a lot of its time having you do less so it can do more, right? Do you honestly think the federal government would have allowed this to happen if they didn't want it? So how'd it get in your schools then? Who did it? That would be the federal Race to the Top program. Have you heard of Race to the Top? Remember back in 2008 when we were scared to death, told by our leaders, Bush going out, Obama coming in, totally bipartisan, right? We were told that unless we pump billions and billions of dollars into banks and car companies, the whole economy was going to collapse. Well, did you know well over $1 billion of that initial stimulus package was siphoned off and given to the Department of Education to begin to create tests and align with these standards, right? To begin to set the stage? The Race to the Top program, back in 2009, 8 and 9. It was a federal program, Barack Obama and Arne Duncan, that was designed to allow every state in the union to apply for Race to the Top money. And why not? It was quote-unquote free money. New York in 2009 became the first state in the union to accept Race to the Top dollars. New York, simply by applying, was given $700 million of taxpayer money in 2009. That money went directly into the coffers of the state of New York schools. They could spend it on whatever they wanted to. And you know what the only real provision was? Any state that took race to the top money had to accept the Common Core state standards when they were finally written. And even states that didn't win initial race to the top grants, and Wisconsin's one, we applied for all kinds of money. We didn't get it initially. We took the standards anyway. Wisconsin became the very first state in the union to accept race to Common Core. We didn't win a grant. But the minute we accepted Common Core, right now as we sit here, over $90 million in the last 3 years have come into the state from the feds to help support Common Core. That's how 46 states in the union got it, sight unseen. Simply by pursuing or accepting race to the top money. That's it. Your states didn't know. How do you call this state-led? Your states didn't know what they were doing. The federal government dangled close to $1 billion in front of the state of New York. Of course they're going to take that money. You're telling me if I take $700 million in 2009 and all I have to do is accept a set of curriculum standards that you haven't written yet, sure, I'll sign on for that. But that's how you got it. The federal government bribed 46 states to take it. It was a bribe. That's why it's illegal, by the way. Why this copyright? Why this copyright? If it is indeed federal, do you understand why they did this? They're indemnifying themselves. First of all, it is illegal for the federal government to interfere this way in state educational decisions. The Article 10 of the Constitution prohibits that, number one. Number two, 3 different federal laws, 3, dating from 1965, prohibit the federal government from setting up national standards or a national curriculum. They can't do it. But they wanted to do it. So, as you can see here, the only thing, Gates couldn't put it in your schools, the 5 individuals, the only thing that put them in your schools was the federal government. And I don't know why it took this long, but we now have our first state governor, your neighbor Bobby Jindal, so to speak. He now is suing the federal government for the illegality of this. And 16 different state governors are contemplating signing on to that lawsuit. This is a violation, constitutional violation, and it is a violation of existing federal law. That's why the copyright looks the way it does. Because this is telling you the feds had nothing to do with this. Bobby Jindal suing to prove otherwise. Let me ask you one more rhetorical question while we're on this. Even if you think you like the standards, what do you think the media would be doing to this day? What do you think the response, the people who support Common Core right now, do you think they would still support it if it was exactly the same standards? And instead of Bill Gates and his billions, it was, oh, I don't know, let's say the Koch brothers. Let's say the Koch brothers put up $6 billion. And let's say instead of 2 left-leaning lobbyist groups, you had 2 right-leaning ones who wrote a bunch of curriculum standards behind closed doors without any real educational experience. What if, instead of a very liberal president, you had a very conservative one who basically bribed 46 states to take a set of curriculum standards that nobody had seen? Do you think Mr. Bice would still support them? Do you think the newspapers would blindly repeat Common Core talking points then? It would be if it were the Koch brothers, it would be on the front page of every newspaper. Rogue billionaire buys public education, wouldn't it? If it were the Koch brothers, Harry Reid's head would explode all over the Senate floor. And you know, I gotta tell you, I would oppose it just as strongly as I would oppose it now, if that were the case. What qualifies Gates to have done this? What qualifies Coleman to have done this? And yet your newspapers, your media outlets, and many of your feckless Republicans, from Jeb Bush to Chris Christie to John Kasich, right, are telling you. They're the ones in your face telling you that if Republicans are telling you that if you don't buy this, you're just a tinfoil hat wearer. Okay? But that's how we got it. 350 talks. Go ahead, prove me wrong. Love to see you do it. But take the slides. And if I'm telling you the truth, then whether you like the standards or not, you got to ask yourself one question. Can we allow this to stand given the way it was done? What do I use the words banana republic? Right? This shouldn't happen. Public school is public, which means it doesn't belong to government. It belongs to you. You, of all people, were not consulted about this. Your state didn't consult you. Your Department of Education didn't consult you. The federal government didn't consult you. They did it to you. Now do you understand why they're so defensive about it? That's how we got it. And so here's my problem, as I said to you already. Whenever I give these talks, whenever any of us give these talks, the simple answer is Tea Party conspiracy nonsense. Okay. So what I decided to do, and I'm going to take about half an hour of your time here, and I'm going to show you why Common Core won't work exclusively through left-wing progressive voices. Because they tell you that it's only the extreme right who opposes this. So I'm going to give you the entire package here, and I'm going to use exclusively radically Democrat progressive voices. Because you've been told, all right, that it's a weird country we live in. It's a weird country in that facts are only facts if you have the correct letter before your name. If you have the correct political affiliation, that's a fact. All right? So, okay, let's see them try to turn these people into tinfoil hat wearing right-wingers. Let's start with the Department of Education. Let's start with the two chief lawyers at the Department of Education. The two men who were hired by the Department of Education to make sure the Department of Education was legally doing things, not illegally. Well, the two chief lawyers said Common Core is not legal. With respect to the race to the top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kenty Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education concluded that, quote, these standards and the tests will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in most states across the Union, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a national K-12 program and raising a fundamental question about whether the department has exceeded its statutory boundaries. You can go take the link. They've written a white paper, these two. It's on the Pioneer Institute site. It's free. You can read their entire argument for the illegality of Common Core. These were the Department of Education's own lawyers when this happened. Now, I'm an English professor, so words are my business, but this one stumps me, okay? I need your help. I'm going to give you 5 words, and I want you to tell me if there's any way you can rearrange those 5 words to have it come out right wing. You ready? New York State Teachers Union. What do you think? Can we work that one? And I want you to notice the date here, a year ago. Why a year ago and not 2? Why a year ago and not 4? The board of New York's Teachers Union on Saturday, this was January of last year, unanimously voted to withdraw support for Common Core standards as they are being implemented, and they declared no confidence in the state education commissioner because the governor of New York didn't take Common Core. The legislatures of New York didn't take it. Who took it? That man, one man, the state education commissioner, John King. So not only do they want the standards gone, they want that man fired. The New York State United Teachers, a union that represents more than 600,000 educational professionals in the state, is also asking the Board of Regents to remove State Education Commissioner John King. And although the union previously backed the Common Core, the union says it will not support the education benchmarks, quote, either as implemented or interpreted. Not the way you wrote them, and not if you try to fix them. And you think about what a progressive, arguably the most progressive state in the union that's not named California. Why are the unions balking? Because they've had it for 3 years longer than you. There are 3 states in the union that got Common Core really early: New York, Florida, and Kentucky. They've already had prototype Common Core testing in those 3 states. New York's test scores went from the high 70s in reading and math all the way down to the 30s. Why do and remember what I told you. New York teachers now are speaking out because the union's on their side. The New York Teachers Union now wants it gone. So now the teachers, 7 out of 10 teachers now are vocally opposing Common Core. Why in New York? Because the unions got their back. That's why. How about, if that's not good enough, how about those right-wingers at the NEA, the largest teachers union in the country? This union, now that the UAW's been hamstrung, this is the most powerful political union in the country. When Governor Walker was recalled a couple of years ago for taking on the teachers unions, the NEA spent about $150 million of its teachers' dues trying to get Governor Walker unelected. That's a good use of their money, right? So the NEA is no right-wing organization, and notice the date. 1 year ago, February 2014, the nation's largest teachers union is pulling back on its once enthusiastic support for Common Core, labeling the rollout, quote, completely botched, unquote. National Education Association President Dennis Van Roekel said, quote, the standards will not succeed without a major course correction, including rewriting the standards and revising the tests with teacher input. Yeah, you heard that right. The tests that are going to measure your teachers and your kids, that are going to form the primary evaluative tool for teachers moving forward. They were not written by teachers. Teachers don't have input on them. Teachers have no ability to change them. Teachers don't even get specific detailed information about the performance of their individual kids about them. There's nothing this test can tell your teachers that will help them teach, nothing. And yet, 32 states have already assigned primary evaluative standard to the tests. We're going to primarily evaluate teachers on how the kids get to these tests now. Do you understand why the unions, you understand this, right? The unions did not have a come to Jesus moment. They suddenly didn't all become teabaggers. The unions recognize that you don't have any local control. What that means is when the feds gear up the tests, that the feds are in charge, because the tests will measure them. Whoever controls the test determines how your teachers are going to end up. And it's not the unions anymore. That's what the unions are concerned about. They lose control over the future of their teachers, their ability to retain their jobs, teacher tenure, teacher promotion, right? It's going to all be geared to national tests that aren't written by educators. That's what the NEA said. Oh, and by the way, Dennis Van Rokel is no longer president of the NEA. He has been replaced by a woman who campaigned for the NEA president as an anti-Common Core warrior. That's who they put in charge. And then you've got, how about the nation's second largest teachers union? How about the American Federation of Teachers? By the way, the AFT is considered to be the more progressive of the two unions. So if the NEA is not radical enough in its politics for you, then join the AFT. And I want you to notice the date, July of last year. In a major surprise, the American Federation of Teachers, the country's second largest teachers union, opened its convention Friday by announcing a step back from Common Core. The AFT will now provide monetary grants to teachers who want to criticize the standards or even write new ones. Yes, right? What an odd thing. Let's pay teachers to craft educator standards. These standards weren't done by educators. So the AFT, and that's a heck of a racket, isn't it? Charge union dues, then dole out some of those union dues back to teachers so they can criticize. You're going to pay. What does that tell you about the AFT's mindset? They're going to pay teachers in states that want Common Core to criticize it. That's a big deal. The AFT's Executive Council also introduced a resolution declaring that the standards may have had noble intentions but have fallen short due to outside meddling, Gates and Coleman, Pearson Publishing, and an inordinate focus on standardized tests. That, by the way, is the other thing that makes this unassailably federal. These big tests that your kids are going to have to start taking. Where does that information go first? Doesn't go to the state of Alabama. Doesn't go to your teachers. Goes to Washington, D.C. That information becomes the property of Washington, D.C. You understand, and I'll show you this in a minute, but if you control the test, then you control the teachers. And we'll get to that in a moment, but just before we leave the AFT, how about this? Common Core has also seen other opposition on the left as well, particularly from a new faction of almost 100,000 left-wing teachers who called themselves the Badass Teachers Association. That number is about 170,000 teachers now. These are I didn't name them that, they're self-described left-wing teachers, 170,000 strong, who formed primarily to fight Common Core. Why? And this is really remarkable. The single biggest point of agreement on the right and the left with regards to Common Core is what it does to special needs kids and what it does to kids in already vulnerable districts, mostly inner city kids who are already behind. The left and the right, believe it or not, the Tea Partiers and the badass teachers are teaming up across the country to fight Common Core on this ground. And how about one of my personal favorites? How about the Chicago Teachers Union? How about President Obama's own backyard? This, by the way, is the most radically progressive city teacher union in the country. Do you know who the Chicago Teachers Union brought as their Martin Luther King Day speaker last year for the elementary school kids? Do you know who that was? The Reverend Jeremiah Wright. That's who they brought. Right? This is a city union that approved a proposed plan a couple years ago, approved a proposed plan that would allow teaching masturbation techniques to kindergarten kids. Just giving you a sense of who they are. That woman right there is Karen Lewis. She is the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. And up until a couple months ago, I think she came down with cancer. Up until a couple months ago, she was running for president running for mayor of Chicago against Rahm Emanuel. And she was running to the left of Rahm Emanuel. I didn't think you could get anything but dryerland to the left of Rahm Emanuel, but she was going to try to pull that off. That's Karen Lewis. Notice the date of this, May of 2014, a year ago. Here's what the whole thing is a quote. Quote, I agree with educators and parents from across the country. The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy. That's all the data mining stuff. As well as an overreach of federal power into state educational autonomy. In other words, it's too much government getting involved in state educational decisions. Exactly what your administrators will tell you isn't going to happen. The irony is a nice English professor word. The irony of this. What does it tell you that a self-professed Marxist thinks that Common Core represents too much federal government? I mean, you can't write a script like that. She goes on to say, quote, Common Core eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration. Of course it does. How are your teachers free to teach? Because you keep hearing this. How are your teachers free to teach what they need to teach and want to teach when the whole thing is guaranteed, is anchored to tests that they have no say over? How are they free? They can't be free. All they're free to do is teach this textbook or that textbook, this Pearson upload or that download. It's all the same stuff. Think about this for a second. Your teachers went home one early June morning for the summer. They came back the following fall, and the textbooks were all gone. They were either replaced with new Common Core textbooks, or there were no textbooks at all, and everything was uploadable from sites like Pearson. How in the world do your teachers learn how to teach Common Core? It's never been done before. How do they learn how to do it? Simply by the pedagogy and the materials that companies like Pearson had provided for them. That's the only tool they had. And you do know, right, that Pearson Publishing, they were in the room with the Common Core people when they were drafting the standards. Pearson Publishing, right, has tailored all that pedagogy to what the people who wrote the standards wanted. How do you make that argument? It's one of the, to me, the biggest, most insipid, dishonest lie of the Common Core people is that it's just a set of standards that's not curriculum. We're going to hit that hard in the next 10 minutes, and I'll show you where I'm getting it from. But what other way is there to teach Common Core methodology than the Common Core materials provided by the people? How are you free if you have to get kids to Common Core competencies on these tests? Where's the freedom in that? How do you argue that they're radically separate things? And I won't even make the argument. I'm going to let our liberal progressives make the argument. Not, oh, this is good. So that's what she means when she says Common Core. Look, I know we've got some teachers here. Go ahead and tell me if I'm wrong. Sometimes a good teacher has to throw the book out. Sometimes a teacher has to put the curriculum aside. You're going to show up to class, and you're going to have 27 kids staring at you with blank looks in their eyes. The best teachers are the ones who can go off script, who can figure out what those kids sitting in front of them need that day. How do you do this? One of the biggest complaints about teachers from Common Core across the country is how this inhibits their ability to do anything independent, creative, or original. The whole thing is scripted. Common Core eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration. We also know that high-stakes standardized tests are designed to rank and sort our children, and that they contribute significantly to racial discrimination and the achievement gap in American schools. And she's right. That's why the badass teachers formed. The kids that get hammered the hardest are the ones who can least afford it. Racial discrimination. Almost all of Karen Lewis's inner city schools are inner city Chicago schools. These are kids who have a whole host of problems, from being underfunded to having no supervision to not getting good teachers because they want to teach in the suburbs. Hard to blame them. Those kids are the ones, and that's discriminatory. She's dead right about that too. And not only did Karen Lewis say these things, but the entire Chicago Teachers Union crafted 30 different anti-Common Core resolutions. I can't read you all of them, just read you a couple of them, so you can hear who's telling you this. Quote, instructional and curriculum decisions should be in the hands of classroom professionals who understand the contexts and interests of their students. What a radical statement. Do you honestly think that some bureaucrat non-educator in Washington knows better what the kids in your classroom need than the teachers who are dealing with them? Your kids aren't all the same kid. This whole standardization scam, we'll talk about that moving forward too. Are your kids standard? Are your kids common? The objective is to get every kid to the same place when they graduate. When they graduate from grade to grade, semester to semester, school to school, when they graduate. Think about it. you're going to get 60 million American school kids to exactly the same place. By definition, is that going to have to be a higher or a lower place? It's going to have to be. There's no doubt about it. We've had standardization in education ever since we got the Department of Education. It has failed every time. You look at the arc of American school performance, we did quite well for 200 years educating our kids. We put a man on the moon with less technology than the cell phone you have in the pocket right now. And we somehow characterized that education system as a failure. Who did that? Who characterized it that way? In the mid-1970s, it wasn't as if teachers said, gee, all of a sudden my kids are stupid. It's not like in the mid-70s, colleges like where I work said, you know what, we're not taking these kids anymore because they don't know anything. That's not what happened. You know who did this? We created the Department of Education. And what did it do? All those billions and billions of dollars that were being doled out directly to the states now had to funnel through the Department of Ed. And the Department of Ed decided how to spend them. And so does it surprise you that a big federal bureaucracy spent most of its time justifying its own existence rather than doing what it needed to be done? You know, the Department of Education has its own SWAT team on ready. What a money sink. If you give the Department of Education $100 million for the states will see about 20 of it. This is the problem. And so what did the Department of Education do in the late 1970s? They had to justify why they were there. So they commissioned education companies like Pearson and McGraw-Hill. They commissioned private educational companies whose job it is to sell curriculum, pedagogy, textbooks. They commissioned those people to create big standardized tests that all our kids had to take. And guess what those Pearson tests proved? The schools sucked, the teachers sucked, the kids sucked. So Pearson, throw it all out. And have you noticed in the last 30 years? Every 5 years we throw everything out and start over again. Somebody's got to make money off that, right? Think about this. Nothing has changed in math education for children from kindergarten through 17 years old. What have we done differently in math in the last 2,000 years? Have we invented a number I'm unaware of? Have we created some new geometrical shape that slipped it into geometry? There's nothing new. Nothing. And if that's the case, you ought to be able to buy one textbook and use it for 50 years. But if you do that, the companies who wrote these tests to prove that all your schools and textbooks were failing, so you have to keep buying new ones, they'd be out of business. Instructional and curriculum decisions should be in the hands of classroom professionals who understand the context and interests of their students. And, quote, the education of children should be grounded in developmentally appropriate practice. The first person to call Common Core developmentally inappropriate isn't me. It's Karen Lewis and her teachers union. And she's right, particularly at the youngest grades. This is developmentally inappropriate stuff. Why wouldn't it be? Non-educators are doing it. Companies are doing it. What makes you think they're going to craft things that are educationally appropriate grade by grade? Common Core standards, let her tell you. Common Core standards were developed by non-practitioners, non-educators, non-teachers, including, who did it? Test and curriculum publishers and education reform foundations, like the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, Achieve, Inc., ALEC, all these 501c3 groups whose objective is not to improve your kid's education, whose objective is to politicize it. That's what they do. And about Bill Gates. He's Bill Gates, so nobody asks what he's getting out of this. For the Koch brothers, we'd ask. It's been estimated that 70%, 70, of American school districts, especially the rural ones and the inner city ones, are going to have to upgrade their technology capacity just to be able to do the kind of completely computerized testing Common Core requires. Whose computers are going in those schools? It's not Apple computers. So in other words, you got Bill Gates investing all this money in this educational scheme, and there is a payoff. Broadband width has to be expanded. Computer technicians have to be hired. New computers, faster computers have to be put in the schools. So every single test by every single kid is done on a computer. Most high schools don't have that many computers. And they don't have new enough ones to handle this. Who's making money off that? Crony capitalism. So in other words, quote, as a result, these standards better reflect the interests and priorities of corporate education reformers than the best interests and priorities of teachers and students. That's one of the reasons I say, you want to support teachers? Get the feds out of it. Let teachers in classrooms deal with kids as they meet them. You know, we only have one really good standard that's always worked for teaching. Most of America, throughout our long history, Most of American kids were educated in one-room schoolhouses. You had 5th graders and 9th graders all in the same little schoolroom, and you know what? It worked really quite well. The only standard that's ever worked, you gotta have a committed parent, a disciplined child, and an effective teacher. That's it. Every step beyond that you weaken education. So when in the 70s, right, control went from the classroom to the districts, and then in the 80s when it went from the districts to the states, and in the late 90s and early 2000s when it went from the states to the federal level, guess what? It gets weaker and weaker and weaker and more meaningless. And I'll prove that to you in a moment, too. This is Michael Mazenko, progressive editor of ultra-progressive website, Salon.com. I want you to listen to what Mr. Mazenko says in an article from July of last year, about 8 months ago. Again, this is an uber-liberal writing for an uber-liberal magazine. The underreported story about Common Core is the millions of dollars to be made developing and selling educational materials and tests linked to the new standards. Please listen to this, because it's not coming from me first. I'll tell you about it. Despite claims by Common Core advocates that standards are not curriculum, school districts are realizing they need to spend money on new materials and training to meet the expectations of the standards, especially if schools are using tests, and all of them are. Without doubt, the implementation of Common Core will cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and the US Department of Education, listen to this, the Federal Department of Education last year alone gave Pearson Publishing $350 million to develop the tests and the assessments. So Pearson Publishing, by definition, makes tests. That's their job. Your federal government is now paying Pearson to do what it otherwise would have done, make tests. Pearson turns around and sells them to states like Alabama, and they keep all the profits. That's crony capitalism, right? There was no open bid process for this. The federal government is required to bid this out so that they can get cheaper deals. They didn't. They just handed it hook, line, and sinker. So your feds are paying Pearson to make all this material. They're paying them to do their job. Then they're letting them reap the windfalls of selling it to you. Clearly, the Common Core has been incredibly lucrative for businesses, while the benefits to students remain dubious at best. And this is a big deal. Please note the date on this. January 24th, 2015, a couple weeks ago. The entire Washington Democrat Party came out and voted to remove Common Core from the state of Wisconsin, well, state of Washington. And as you know, right, Washington is a vastly more progressive state than you are. Go ahead and try to turn this into a right-wing issue. Go ahead and try to pretend that this has nothing to do with facts and everything to do with politics. I'm going to read to you the Washington State Anti-Common Core Resolution, all Democrat Party. If you didn't know any better, you would think this was a Tea Party statement. Here's what the Washington Democrats said. Well, first the article. The Central Committee of the Washington State Democrat Party passed a resolution that roundly condemns the Common Core standards. This is the first time a statewide Democrat Party committee has taken a public position against the Common Core. And it happened right in the backyard of the Bill Gates Foundation, Washington State, which has provided the funding that made the National Standards Project possible. This could signal a sea change for the beleaguered standards, because up till now, political opposition has been strongest in the Republican Party. Even that article's not right. You've seen all these people who aren't Republicans saying all these things before Washington pulled out, right? Even people who don't like Common Core, they've bought the talking point that it's primarily a Republican issue. This is a big deal. So here's the resolution. Whereas the copyrighted and therefore unchangeable Common Core state standards are a set of controversial, top-down K-12 academic standards that were promulgated by wealthy private interests without any research-based evidence of validity, and are developmentally inappropriate at the lowest grades. And whereas, as a means of avoiding the US Constitution's 10th Amendment prohibition, can I just pause here for a second? Thank them very much. Democrats pointing to the Constitution. Isn't that amazing? Whereas, as a means of avoiding the US Constitution's 10th Amendment prohibition against federal meddling in state education policy, listen to them, not me. 2 unaccountable, private trade associations, the NGA and the CCSSO, have received millions of dollars in funding from the Gates Foundation and others to create Common Core. And whereas the U.S. Department of Education improperly pressured state legislatures into adopting the standards and the tests, basing them as a condition of competing for federal race to the top dollars. Stimulus funds that should have gone to states based on need, not bribery, right? Sorry. Whereas implementation of Common Core will cost local school districts hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for standardized computer-based tests, new technology, new curricula, and teacher training at a time when Washington is already insufficiently funding K-12 basic education without any proven benefits to students. And whereas some states have already withdrawn from Common Core, therefore, be it resolved that we call upon the Washington State Legislature and the Superintendent of Public Instruction to withdraw from Common Core and keep K-12 education student-centered and accountable to the people of Washington State. And if they can do that, Alabama, why haven't you? You cannot make an argument that allowing Alabama to look after Alabama school kids is better than letting the federal government do. You cannot make that. Try it. Even if you want Common Core, get out of the Fed program. I hope you don't, but even if you want Common Core, reject the Fed money. Just reject it. It comes to less than 8%, Alabama, the money they're dangling in front of you. Less than 8% of your total state budget for education. It's meaningless. You could make it back easily in other ways. You don't even need their money. Then go ahead and make Alabama Common Core, because in 3 years when the whole thing is a disaster, you, Alabama, can get out without having to consult the feds. Once you're in this, you're not getting out of it now. That's why Common Core is dangerous. Once it's federalized this way, you're not getting it back. So, there you got the Democrat Party. And please pay attention to what I'm telling you. This is exactly what we've been telling you for 5 years. Notice the date on this, January 29th of 2015. School districts are already now suing the states, suing their own states to pay for the tests. Because the federal government's not paying all that money for your upgrades. So this is brilliant. A number of school districts in California are banding together to sue the state of California, because California took it. Without consulting the schools, California took it. So then you should pay for it. And you know what that means? That means the taxpayers. The state of California could be liable, are you ready for this? For as much as $1 billion a year in costs if a group of school districts succeeds in winning reimbursement for expenses associated with the implementation of computer-based tests in the Common Core and other new state standards. 4 unified districts, Santa Ana, Vallejo, Plumas, and Porterville, and the Plumas County Office of Education, filed a claim to classify the new tests as state mandates. The state took Common Core. We have to comply with it. The tests are mandates. So you got to pay for it, California. Right? If the Commission on State Mandates agrees, the state will be required to reimburse all districts statewide. The estimate for 1 year's testing technology, $1 billion in California. That trumps anything, Alabama, the feds gave you to take Common Core to begin with. Second part of the article. The districts contend that unlike the old pencil and paper tests, the new computer-based tests require districts to buy computers, expand bandwidth, right? Install wireless connections, hire technicians, train district staff. In its filing, Santa Ana, the biggest of the 4 districts with about 50,000 students, said it is expecting to spend that district alone about $12 million last year, 12 more this year, on devices and bandwidth expansion, including $124,000 simply on staff time to train them. The district said it has not yet determined its training costs. The claim estimates the statewide cost for all districts for 1 year, $1 billion. Right? They told you this wasn't going to happen, but it's happening. How about this? If Common Core is state-led, then shouldn't states be able to walk away from it? Shouldn't they? Shouldn't you? If you decide, you know what, we got into it, now we don't like it, we're going to... But no, you can't do that. Notice this, notice the date, January 31st, 2015. What happened? I've already showed you Chicago, right? The city of Chicago refuses to give the tests to all their students because they correctly think that the tests are meaningless and they're stressful. So they only want to give the test, Chicago, to 10% of their students. The entire rest of the state of Illinois is 100% on board with Common Core. Simply because Chicago, one district, wants to give the test in a limited capacity, your federal government is threatening to withhold their entire federal education budget from them. You please tell me how this is state-led? If it's state-led, you shouldn't have been bribed to get into it, and you should be able to walk away from it. Chicago Public Schools' decision to administer new tests, Common Core tests, to only about 10% of the city's 600 schools could cost the state over $1 billion. So it's going to cost $1 billion for California to pay for the exams. It's going to cost Illinois $1 billion because they won't give the test to everybody. In a recent letter to Illinois School Superintendent Christopher Koch, former Assistant U.S. Education Secretary Deborah Delisle made it clear the states could lose as much as $1.17 billion in federal aid, federal education funding next year if Chicago schools don't comply with Common Core testing. Now do you understand what we say? That whoever controls the tests controls what your teachers teach and what your kids learn. The feds control them. You don't have to offer them, Chicago, and you will get not one penny of Illinois money from us. This is not Common Core money. We're not going to give you any of your federal budget if you don't do what we tell you to do, right? That money represents about 84% of the state's federal aid budget and about $1 in $10 spent by. So think about that. What a boondoggle that is. That $1.17 billion that your federal government sends to Illinois every year for education, that's not even 100% of what the state sends, of the feds send them. And all that money the feds send represents only 10% of the money Illinois spends on education every year. What would happen if they just said, forget it? Nothing. It's a drop in the bucket financially. But simply taking the standards and the test puts you on the hook to these guys, right? And we're almost ready for the break. Don't listen to me. You don't know me. I don't require your trust. I'm grateful that you're listening. You shouldn't trust me until you verify what I've told you. So don't listen to me. Let's listen to the people who did this. Let's listen to the people who did this. How many of you have heard that Common Core standards are rigorous and benchmarked? How many of you, oh, y'all have, right? Okay, let's listen to what Bill Gates said back in 2013, all right?
It would be great if our education stuff worked, but that we won't know for probably a decade.
So in 2013, so 10 years is 2023. We won't know for 10 years if any of this is going to work. How is this benchmarked? How is this rigorous? The guy who paid for it told you it's going to be 10 years before we can even begin to figure out if it works. How about this, right? You've heard that Common Core is just a set of standards. Teachers are free to teach what they want. It's not curriculum. Okay, listen to the man way back in 2009 when this whole scam was perpetrated. You ready?
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards. Secretary Arne Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests, next generation assessments aligned to the Common Core. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well.
So again, you're being lied to. The people who did this told you every single Common Core talking point people like Dr. Bice repeat glibly to you have been refuted by the people who paid for it, created it, and stuck it in your schools. You heard what he said? The curriculum will, when we align the standards to the test, that's this spring, Alabama, the curriculum lines up as well. There is no choice. And that's not enough for you? Let's go to David Coleman. This is David Coleman, the architect of Common Core. You ready to have your blood boil? This is David Coleman giving the lie to I told you, this is the biggest lie of Common Core. They're just standards, benign, innocent standards. They have nothing to do with curriculum. Listen to what David Coleman said in 2011.
Which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand-waving. There's no amount of saying they teach to the standards, not the test. We don't do that here, whatever.
Okay, what do you make of that? He's kind of rubbing it in your face, isn't he? There's no force. Listen to this. Unelected bureaucrat who's never been a teacher telling you that there is no force on earth strong enough from stopping your teachers to teach to our tests. None of this nonsense about they teach to standards, not to tests, whatever. I'm playing that for you one more time.
which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand-waving. There's no amount of saying they teach to the standards, not the test. We don't do that here, whatever.
Whatever indeed, Mr. Coleman. Whatever is the attitude of people like him to all your concerns. For how dare you be concerned that maybe this doesn't work? How dare you be concerned? How dare you tell people with PhDs in education, right, that you have something to contribute to their grand schemes? Whose children are they? Okay, notice this. Notice the source. Center for Teaching Quality. Go to their website. You can see all their research. Compiled from every school, every state in the country, hundreds of school districts. For an average fourth grader in Common Core, average across the country, 51 days of a 180-day school year are spent testing. 51 of 180. Go look at their research, all the places they've compiled this. For the average American fourth grader, based on their very copious sample, 51 days of a typical fourth grader's year will be spent testing. Right? That's why over 32 school districts already in this country, big ones, have come out with a policy that they will no longer test their kids any other way but Common Core. You've got American school districts, a bunch of them, big ones, who've already said there's so much Common Core testing, we're going to get rid of final exams and midterm exams. We will not let our teachers offer tests or quizzes on what they've done. Common Core testing is so onerous, we can't have kids take other tests. So already, your schools are voluntarily even giving up their ability to test their children on what the teachers are teaching them, because Common Core testing has taken that over. And then there's this, and we'll go to your break. We've had 50 different academic studies done in the last 40 years, assessing the validity of standards at the state and federal level to what goes on in your kids' classrooms. Professional university studies. Do you know what each of these studies conclude? There is absolutely no impact whatsoever with a state or federal standard on how your kids perform in the classroom. All this BS that you keep hearing, that we need standards. If you don't have these, you don't have standards. The standard is a committed parent, a disciplined child, and a teacher. That's it. Every step beyond that at the state and federal level you take, there is no impact. There is not one iota of proof that those standards have any positive effect on your kids. And yet you're spending all this money, you're throwing everything out, you're reinventing the wheel, you're ceding power to the federal government. For what? It doesn't work. This is only the most comprehensive study. This is the Brown Center Report on American Education. It's produced by the left-leaning think tank, the Brookings Institute. This is one that you can go online and type it in. You can see all their data. It's the biggest study ever done. And do you know what it concludes? That this Common Core is going to have no impact on your kids' education. None. I'm only going to read you the last two paragraphs. What effect will the Common Core have on national achievement? The analysis presented here suggests very little impact. The quality of the Common Core standards are currently being hotly debated, but the quality of past curriculum standards has been unrelated to student achievement. The rigor of performance standards, there's that word, right? You've been rigor mortis, haven't you? They keep telling you it's rigor without proof, and how can you argue against rigor? I want my kid to be rigorously educated. It's meaningless. The rigor of performance standards, how high the bar is set for proficiency, has also been unrelated to achievement. So why are you doing it? There's no reason. Last paragraph. Do not expect much from Common Core. Educational leaders often talk about standards as if they are a system of weights and measures. The word benchmarks is used promiscuously. I like the word promiscuous because there's a whole lot of hoes involved here, right? The word benchmarks is used promiscuously as a synonym for standards. But the term is misleading by inferring that there is some real known standard of measurement. Do you understand that you cannot craft a single exam, a single measurement that measures 60 million school kids? How do you take into account on one standardized test socioeconomic background, racial disparities, family structure disparities, location, rural versus big city, the quality of teachers, the money spent on schools. You can't take any of that into account. It is a mathematically meaningless test. And that's what the Brookings Institute is telling you. How about this? Standards in education are about as good as your New Year's Eve resolution. These at the state and fed, you can have standards in a classroom. Teacher has a standard. Kids, you're going to be reading at this level by the time you're done with third grade. That's a standard, and it's a much more effective standard, especially if you've got a mom and dad who turns off the iPod and makes the kid learn, pulls them out of football if the kid's not getting enough. You got to have a committed parent. How many of us are committed? You got to have a disciplined child, right? I'm in the South. Well, I love the South. I still hear yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am down here. You don't hear it in Wisconsin, I'll tell you that right now. Disciplined children, committed parents, and an effective teacher. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, 2/3 of what you need to educate your kids is all in the family. The farther up you get here, the more meaningless it gets. So in other words, standards are aspirational. What that means is you go to bed on New Year's Eve after a couple belts of champagne, and you resolve the new standard for you is going to be getting up and running every morning. That standard is meaningless unless you drag yourself out of bed on a freezing cold 50-degree Alabama day, right? You drag yourself, try doing it in Wisconsin. It's only as meaningful as the effort you put into it. It has no bearing on anything. And one of the second biggest lie of Common Core behind the it's just standards, not curriculum, is the lie that says exactly that, right? This lie about that if you don't have Common Core, you don't have standards. The only way you can have any meaningful measure of education is if everybody's doing national stuff. It's absurd, okay? All right, the second part of this talk is downhill. It's a lot quicker and more effective. But I'm telling you, you have to hear these things. This is how it was done. Every single piece of evidence you heard is documented. You can have it. And all of it comes from liberal progressive voices, not me. All right? Take 5 or 6 minutes, and we will come back and do the second half. Thanks.
Is that we have 2 of our representatives here today that I want you to meet and I want you to be in regular contact with. And our former Senator Scott Beeson. So Representative Friday, Mr. Mooney, would y'all please come up so everybody could meet you? I want to introduce you. Let's thank them for being here today with us. And you will remember our former Senator Scott Beeson. These men will be responsible, and Scott will talk to us at the end about what our action steps will be from here, because he was the first one to bring up a bill to repeal back in 2012. Or is it 20? I mean, it's years ago. But he started the repeal movement. And so we are thrilled that he is here. We are thrilled that Representative Mooney and Representative Friday are here. Their information is available on our legislative delegation website. Become friends with these men. They are the ones that will be making a difference that we will get in touch with, right? We're going to go out and become warriors. We will stay in regular contact with them, and we will encourage them as they fight for us. So thank you very much for being here today.
Are we back ready? Can you hear me okay? Okay, and I just would like to reiterate at the beginning, that's exactly right. You have to have the information. You have to have the facts. You can't be a good warrior without the facts, but as soon as you have this information, unless you're willing to do something about it, this isn't going anywhere. You must realize that a lot of you have come up to me, and I'm glad to hear from you that this is upsetting to you, that you didn't know all this. That's great. But you got to understand, every day down in Montgomery at the State House, you have lobbyists from places like Pearson in every one of your politicians' offices telling them how much money this is going to bring the state, how much money we're going to raise for you, how much help Pearson's going to give you. You have absolute lobbyists in the State House every day in the ear of your politicians. Unless they hear from you in a concerted and consistent way, they're going to default to what they hear every day. That's the problem we have. The big corporate interests behind this are promising the moon, promising the world, right? We'll help your rural school districts with their computers. The Gates Foundation, right? You keep Common Core, we'll give you a grant to get our Microsoft computers at half price, right? All this kind of stuff is going on behind the scenes to keep this. If this was just a matter of what the people of Alabama wanted, and your representatives looking after this would have been gone 3 years ago when the former senator here put the stuff out there. You guys would have gotten rid of this already. You're not just dealing with politicians who have to be educated. You're dealing with politicians who have to be convinced that your wants, your needs as constituents outweigh these interests who are promising them all this stuff. In other words, this is meaningless unless you translate it into some kind of action. So we'll keep going here. Now, this second half of the talk, we can do more efficiently. And the one premise I'm going to insist upon is this. I think we've made the case enough that the standards cannot be viewed outside of the pedagogy that teach it. That the standards only matter to the degree that the materials that are used and the approach to teaching are lined up with it. Gates said it, Coleman said it, the Washington State Democrats said it. Everybody we heard made effectively the same point. In fact, it's not even the standards themselves that are the main piece of this. It's how they're taught, what the rationale is behind them, the pedagogy that's been produced, specifically tailored to meet the needs of the standards. It's sociology. We've already shown, and I think categorically, that this isn't going to help education. This is not going to make your kids better at math or better at reading, better at history. It's not going to do that. What it's going to do is sociologize those issues. You can fight all you want about whether or not the standard of Common Core is higher or lower than what Alabama already had. And in some ways it is higher, and in some ways it's not higher. That is all meaningless. What matters here is what is the tendentious purpose of it? What does it do and how does it do it? One last little history lesson, and then we'll begin to look at the standards. Transparency. Keep asking you that question. Even if you think you like the standards, how do we live with how they were put in? How do we live with the control it seeds? How do we live with the cost of this? How do we live with the lying claims of rigor and benchmarking that clearly can't be true? The people who put it in told you that. We can't allow it to happen. We can't stand for it. But one last little history lesson to make my final point about how untransparent the Common Core people are. I'm being very transparent. You can have it all. I'm the one telling you, don't trust me. They're not transparent. Back in 2012, after the standards had been fleshed out, the Common Core people did something that you would be tempted to see as a good idea. They hired an outside committee to come to Washington to evaluate the standards, and they gave this committee absolute carte blanche. The committee could throw it out, the committee could trash the standards, the committee could revise them, or just approve them. That committee was called the Validation Committee. And it's interesting. You understand when I tell you this. If you're going to helped craft standards on a state level in a very narrow area. That's hard. Crafting a national standard for mathematics requires such a high level of mathematics. In fact, there's only 22 math professors in this whole country who have the mathematical skills to be able to conceive of a national standard in math. None of them were consulted in the writing of Common Core. In fact, that committee that was brought to Washington, D.C. to validate the standards only had one math expert and one English expert on it. When I say expert, a mathematician with enough math to craft a national standard. Sure, there was like a sixth grade middle school math teacher on the committee, the validation committee. A sixth grade math teacher, no disrespect, doesn't have anywhere near the math to be able to craft a national standard. One expert in math, his name is Professor James Milgram. He is a retired Stanford University math professor, and he's been to your state to testify against Common Core. Milgram is serious. Most of the math that got us to the moon in 1969 was Milgram's. As a very young man, he was a math savant. And a lot of the math that put us on the moon was his. He was the guy they invited. Jim Milgram said about Common Core math after evaluating it, and I quote, "It is an absolute joke to think that Common Core math will prepare your kids for STEM careers in science, technology, engineering, and math, or even for math at a four-year college. It's an absolute joke. Get rid of the standards." The only English expert they brought in was Dr. Sandra Stotsky, and she's been to your state 3 or 4 times. She is an English language arts specialist, a retired professor from the University of Arkansas, considered one of the most foremost experts on developmental English in the world. She said about the standards, and I quote, "These standards in reading, writing, and comprehension will set our kids 3 years behind the 3 years they're already behind the high-achieving countries. Throw them out immediately." By the way, just for the record, because we're playing this game, both Sandy and Jim are lifetime Democrat voters. They are not Republican shills, right? They have doing what they're doing. They both voted no in no uncertain terms. They convinced other people on the committee to vote no. You know what the Common Core did? They just erased them from all the documents. They just cut their names out. They refused to even publish as part of the minutes of the Common Core Committee what their objections were. That's why Stotsky and Milgram have been to your states and all states, right? They were the experts. They said no. They were written out of the document. This comes directly from Sandy. And as an English professor, it makes perfect sense to me. What's wrong with the Common Core English standards? Right? And what do I mean when I say they are sociological, not educational? Well, for starters, when you keep in mind that the standards are only meaningful to the degree that they're taught to and how they're taught to. The Common Core requires, through this union, that 50% of the literature that your kids used to read in English class is being removed in favor of informational texts, many of which come directly from the federal government. As Sandy says, what's happening in your classrooms is that they're pulling out literature, they're pulling out the stories that your kids have read, and they're adding propaganda. Because whenever you present kids with one side of a story exclusively, that's propaganda. As Sandy says, this isn't critical thinking. Critical thinking is when you allow kids to see multiple views of an issue and you let them decide. All the views are coming one way, handed directly from the federal government. I'll show you some examples in a moment. But a quick digression. Why do we teach our kids stories in English class? When you put your kids to bed at night, you read them a bedtime story. And the purpose is to get them to go to sleep. So why are you reading them stories that get them all excited? Make their little hearts thump and their eyelids bat? If you want to put kids to sleep, shouldn't you read them a Bill Gates computer manual? I mean, think about it. All right, they'd be asleep in 2 seconds, but you don't, because intrinsically you know that kids only learn how to read and learn how to love reading when they read stories. When you read the classics, when you read things like Shakespeare, you have no idea what Shakespeare's views of illegal immigration were. When you read Charlotte Bronte, right, you have no idea what old Charlotte would have thought about green energy tech. When you read literature and stories in the classics, you talk about big issue things like love and truth and war and peace and justice. Taking that literature out, 50% of it out, and replacing it with very tendentious political stuff, most of which comes from the federal government, isn't good for anybody. So consequently, you get much less discussion of ethics, morality, character, and more political indoctrination. Less classic literature and more informational texts is what the Common Core calls them. Think about what the Common Core, this is how deceptive it all is. The Common Core standards don't require much of anything to be read. They do have a small list of things, but it's not terribly major. That's why people say you can teach what you want. However, the Common Core people working with textbook companies like Pearson, they created a list of about 400 quote-unquote exemplar texts. These are the texts that Common Core says, hey, we're not going to make you read anything, but these are the only 400 texts that are Common Core approved, wink, wink. So guess what the textbook companies put in all the English readers? Some variant of the text the Common Core people approved. That's why you cannot argue that the standards in the curriculum aren't the same thing. Common Core said, we're not going to force you to read anything, but here are the only texts we approve of. And people like Pearson came and took those texts and broke them out and put them in all the assignment sheets. That's how you got here, right? And if you take a look, before we leave this, the other thing Common Core does that's shocking, and against every piece of pedagogy we have, every metric we have, Common Core required, they lower the overall level of reading in Common Core at every grade level by 50%. Your kids who aren't reading enough now are now reading 50% less, and they are writing 50% more. Your kids are now writing significantly more than they're reading at every grade level. And that begs the question, Sandy says. If they're writing more than they're reading, what are they writing about? Maybe that's how you got the assignment in my state of Wisconsin about almost 2 years ago now, when little 8-year-olds, third graders, were sent home by a Wisconsin public school and told to write an essay on how the state is just like the family, but better. This is the sociological component. Here, we'll see some of the sociology here. Here are some of the books that replace literature in your kids' high schools. By the time your daughter's in 9th grade, she's going to be reading things like Recommended Levels of Insulation, a report released in 2010 by the US EPA and the Department of Energy. Read it. It is not a narrative, it's not a story. It's basically a long list of regulations, environmentally correct regulations about the proper way to insulate new buildings. Is that the kind of thing, and why are you doing this in English class? Why is literature stories being pulled out, reading being de-emphasized, and all of the sociological stuff being put in? Sandy estimates that about 35% of the exemplar texts in the Common Core manuals all deal with man-made global warming without any questioning of it and blaming America primarily for it. In fact, there's not a single environmentalist text in the English paradigm that dares to even suggest that anybody other than America is polluting the planet. It's just us, right? And as she says, how about look at the last one, the evolution of the grocery bag. I've read it, a long essay that concludes paper and plastic are both bad and America's destroying the planet. On the basis of that essay, the state of California, about 4 months ago, outlawed plastic bags throughout the state of California. And then President Obama's own executive orders. The White House has literally put into the potential reading materials for your kids, White House talking points. They'll be reading things like, by the time your son's in 10th grade, President Obama's Executive Order 13423, strengthening federal environmental, energy, and transportation management. Over and over again, Sandy points out, that literature goes, this stuff gets put in. This is not, and why the science and tech stuff are they reading in English? Why are they incorporating this stuff here? And then, as Sandy also points out, this is probably the most sensational aspect of the whole thing. Sandy asked the question, why, of what little literature is left in Common Core? Why is so much of the remaining stuff developmentally inappropriate? This is what they were telling you, all those Democrat sources, developmentally and sexually inappropriate for kids. This is Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Toni Morrison is an amazing American writer. She's a Nobel Prize winner, African-American novelist. But we would not assign this book to freshmen in college. It's a book about a 12-year-old girl who's a victim of rape and incest. And over the course of the book, she comes to bond with her rapist and writes in shockingly graphic ways about the nature of their encounters. This is one of about 36 different books at the high school level alone that contain shocking levels of sexuality. You probably may not even be able to read it all. The bad words have been blocked out. So if you can't see that and would like to, come up to me afterwards. This book has been pulled out of Common Core classrooms for kids as young as 8th grade, middle school. This book has been pulled out of Catholic Common Core school textbooks for kids as young as 8th grade. There are 36 different books, including books like Dreaming in Cuban and Black Swan, that have shockingly graphic sexual scenes in them. As Sandy says, why are they there? There's absolutely no justifiable reason to put books like this in at every level of the curriculum that are shockingly graphic, unless you have a sociological rather than an educational ambition. There's a reason we are sexualizing children at younger ages, and it's going to be my point. I've already made it implicitly, but I'm going to say it now. The purpose of all of this, whether it's works or not, or as an educational philosophy, the purpose is the sociology that comes with it, the social engineering. Right? Are you with me? Thank you, sweetie. I got a That's good. All right. Take this. It's not just the high school. Obviously, third graders aren't reading shockingly graphic pornography, but even the reading assignments for third graders are highly loaded and weighted. This is an actual assignment for an 8-year-old, a third grader. And ideologically, it's not a bad idea. You send kids home with a paragraph. Kids read the paragraph, and they have to answer some questions. Who's the main character? What's the theme of the paragraph? That's a perfectly acceptable assignment until you think about the kind of ways that the Common Core assignments are being written. This is the one for a third grader. I'll read the paragraph for you. Ruby sat on the bed she shared, Ruby sat on the bed she shared with her husband, holding a hair clip. There was something mysterious and powerful about the cheaply manufactured neon clip that she was fondling in her newly suspicious palms. She didn't recognize the hair clip. It was too big to be their daughter's, and Ruby was sure it wasn't hers. She hadn't had friends over in weeks, and here was this hair clip, little and green, with a few long black strands of hair caught in it. Ruby ran her fingers through her own blonde hair. She had just been vacuuming when she noticed this small, bright green object under the bed. Now their life would never be the same. She would wait here until her husband, Mike, returned home. And the kids have to conclude at 8 that dad is having an adulterous affair in mom's bed. And notice what the moms, why this is going on all across the country. Moms and dads are Xing out Common Core assignments and sending them back. X'd out, inappropriate. I'm not explaining this to an 8-year-old. Why do we have a paradigm now? And with trying to respect your time, if you gave me 4 hours, I'd show you 50 more of these. And you gave me a week, I'd show you 100 more of these. Type in sexualized Common Core lessons to Google, you'll find 1,000 of these. Different kinds, right? Inappropriate at different ages. The older you get, the more startlingly inappropriate they are. It becomes a serious question. Much less reading, much more writing. Removal of literature, replacement with ideologically one-sided, and I insist on asserting to you, I wouldn't want the informational text to be coming from the right any more than I want them coming from the left. I want education to be a neutral thing. I want kids to be educated in a way that allows them to move. So you see the problem that we have here. All of this, by the way, flies in the face of good pedagogy. Right? Kids learn to read by reading increasingly complicated books that challenge them. One of the benefits of teaching kids stories and classics is that it also inculcates certain ethical and moral values, right? That's being removed in favor of a highly politicized, one-sided kind of informational dialogue with students. And because students are writing more than they're reading, then these assignments and this is the other shocking thing about Common Core. So much of what the teachers are doing, they're not crafting themselves. The assignments are scripted, they're uploaded from companies like Pearson onto a teacher's computer. She just simply hands them out. You know your Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, about a year ago. He came out publicly, Arne Duncan, and said we have to stop referring to teachers as teachers. They're facilitators. And many of the new Common Core textbooks aren't referring to teachers as teachers. They're calling them facilitators. Think about what that means. A teacher is somebody who has insight, wisdom, and knowledge to give to her kids. A facilitator is simply somebody who's handed something and hands it off to somebody else. That's what's going on with Common Core. Right? That's why the teachers' unions are balking. You can't hold teachers accountable when they don't get to create the lessons, they have no input on the tests, right? This is what you've got taking place. These are qualifying issues for Common Core. Then there is the math stuff, and this is even more significant, I think. Because you can always have kids read other things. You can find ways to try to minimize the impact of Common Core. But the math is even a bigger deal, I think. And for an English professor, that means a lot for me to say that. Professor Milgram, and talking to him, because we had him testify in Wisconsin too. And by the way, if you go to that website at the end, you can watch Professor Milgram's entire testimony on Common Core. 3 hours in Wisconsin. All the charts, the graph, the math, and the data. 3 hours he talked to our Wisconsin legislature. They're as thick-headed in many ways as yours. And do you know the only question Milgram got when he was done testifying? Who paid you to be here? That's all they cared about. Who paid you to be here? Who are you shilling for, right? That was it. That's all they cared about. But Milgram, in talking to him, the first thing he did when he got to the validation committee is he says, okay, you keep claiming that Common Core is internationally benchmarked. What countries did you test it against? And they were eager to hand him a list. Sweden, South Korea, Thailand, the places that do math very well. Milgram said, great, 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 now show me your math. For the entire duration of time Milgram sat on that committee, they did not produce one single shred of evidence. They refused to provide any evidence that they mathematically measured this at all. Matter of fact, 6 years into Common Core now, nobody anywhere has seen any evidence whatsoever that they actually did what they said they did, benchmarked it. Furthermore, and they've been claiming that for years. Last year, the Common Core people quietly dropped that claim from their website. They removed it, that the standards were internationally benchmarked in math. They just made it go away. They can't prove it because it's never been done. That's one of the reasons Milgram rejected it. It's a big deal. And so I asked Professor Milgram, and he talks about this freely. He talked about it when he was here. In Milgram's own words, Common Core math is what he calls social justice math. It starts from the premise that it's not fair that so few people can do math well. And I think that's true. Not everyone has a math gift. It's a skill like anything. I teach Shakespeare. Most of my kids, no matter what I do, they're not going to make much of it. People aren't all wired the same way. But in the same way, a lot of kids can't do math at a high level. I want every kid to be basically math literate, but everyone is not a mathematician. And so the Common Core people see that as unjust. It's not fair that, 20% of any, 15% of any math class is going to be able to get it at a high level? That's not fair. So what we need to do, this is the sociology. We need to create a math paradigm where everyone is comfortable with a little math and nobody's allowed to learn a lot of it. Milgram points out, by the way, that in every high-achieving math country on earth, all of them, kids start algebra in 7th or 6th grade, 6th grade. In No Child Left Behind America, our kids did not start serious algebra until 8th grade. And under Common Core, algebra is pushed into 9th grade. Kids don't even really start it until 9th grade high school. As he points out, if you got a kid starting serious algebra in 9th grade, you will never get them to calculus by the time they graduate. And if they're not getting calculus and advanced math, how are you going to prepare them? How are they going to go to college? And where are your architects, your doctors, and your engineers going to come from? In Milgram's own words, it's much less important to let kids who can do math than it is to make everybody feel good about the math that they can do. This video, he points out, it's a young woman, and you cannot make it up. The woman is a community organizer from the city of Chicago. And she's talking to a group of Illinois high school math teachers about the defining premise of Common Core math.
But even under the new Common Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and in oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture, but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how and the why.
In other words, it's communal math, right? The purpose is not to get the right answer. The purpose, and one of the primary ways that Common Core math is taught at the pivotal elementary level, is to put kids in groups of 2 and 3. Teachers who are facilitators don't really teach math. The teacher hands the kids in little groups a math problem. And the overriding purpose of the assignment is not to get the right answer. It's to get all 3 kids in the group to agree on an answer. We actually have an exam from a little boy in New York State. 7 times 6, he wrote 42. He got it marked wrong. The teacher said, the other 2 children in your group agreed on a different answer. So they got credit for it. And the little boy who got the right answer got it marked wrong because he couldn't make them agree with him. Consensus, community, right? These sociological values we're using to teach your kids math. The actual achievement of math is second. And I don't want to be glib. I understand that when I was a bad math student, if the teachers didn't give me points for showing my work, I would have failed every grade. All right? They gave me enough points, but they realized I got my college math professor, my math requirement, pulled me aside at the end of the term and says, son, I'm giving you a pity C-. He says, you are clearly an English person. I'm going to give you a C-. Go and don't take any more math classes. And he was 100% right. All right? In 3rd grade, I had a 2nd grade math level. And it's not much better today. I mean, I can balance a checkbook and leave a tip, although I always leave 20% because the 5 just drives me insane. But I've been successful. Maybe that's, but you know, when I was in 2nd grade, 3rd grade, I also had a high school reading level. And so in 3rd grade, I was reading things like Dante and Aeschylus and Shakespeare. It's probably why I entered the high finance world of college English professor. Right? But so what? This is one of the fundamental issues of Common Core. It's a sociological issue. Are all your kids the same kid? I want the kids, what would my life have been like if in 3rd grade I was forced to keep reading 3rd grade books so as not to traumatize the other students? And I'm more concerned about the kid in 3rd grade math who's way beyond this stuff. What's going to happen to her? Right? But this is what the calculated gamble is. Social justice dictates that every kid is the same kid. It's not fair that you and I have different gifts. And you understand, if you're going to get those 60 million kids to the same place, it cannot be a high place. If you're going to get me as part of any math standard, it's not going to be a high one. Look, it's the same attitude. The NBA isn't diverse enough. It's socially unjust, the NBA. There's nobody in the NBA who looks like me. Right? If you want to make the NBA more universally representative and you want to get, and I'm not picky, I'll be the 13th man, sit on the edge of the bench, wear a snazzy little jumpsuit and wave a towel. Just give me my $4.1 million average NBA salary and I won't make any waves. But if you're going to get the NBA to look more like me, any of you going to pay to watch it? No. What suffers if that's your attitude? Those people who, and what about the guy I'm taking a seat away from who can play basketball? How is that different than this? And look, you've listened to me long enough that A, number one, you see that almost everything I'm telling you has nothing to do with me. And B, you can decide for yourself whether I'm worth listening to. So I'm going to say this now because I think we've done enough legwork. Please tell me how outcome-based education, which we've had for 30 years in this country, please tell me how it's not socialism. I mean, it doesn't matter where you start. Doesn't matter what your gifts or aptitudes are. Doesn't matter how hard the kid works or doesn't work or what their IQs are in certain subjects. Doesn't matter how much family and school support they have. All that matters is when they graduate from grade 3rd, they're going to know exactly what the other 3rd graders know. The ones that work hard and try versus the ones who don't, right? The ones who have innate abilities and the ones who don't, they all got to be in the same place. Please tell me how that's not socialism. I mean, it is. But that surely isn't your view of your kids. They're not common. They're not standard. I love what Albert Einstein said 80 years ago. Albert Einstein said, "You standardize automobiles. You do not standardize children. I do not want to live in a country that standardizes children," right? And Albert and I both failed math. So there you go. Shows you, right? Okay, and then there's this. This is a biggie. And in the same way that if you type in sexualized Common Core English, you'll find 1,000 of them. The same, if you type in to Google goofy Common Core math, you'll find 10,000 examples of this, of just how counterintuitive, reductive, abstract, and for lack of a better word, goofy it is. This woman in the video, the mom, you never see her. She's a college math professor, university math professor. She cannot help her 8-year-old daughter with her math homework. And so she puts the little girl at the whiteboard and makes her do a math problem. It's kind of it's a very illustrative example. Now, again, if every time Common Core math was done, it was done exactly like this, I might be able to figure it out. But it's never the same way twice. The methodology, right? So listen, watch this short example and you'll see what we're talking about here. Here's your math problem. Add those 3 numbers, 1568, 1423, and 680.
So what I want you to do is, can you solve that problem showing me the way that you learned how to solve it in school?
Okay.
And talk to me while you're solving it.
So we learned that a big square like this is 100. So we could make that 100 into a cube, which would make 1,000. So I'm going to do that. Oh, no.
So a square is 100 and a cube is 1,000.
That's 1,000. Mm-hmm. And now we still have to do 500. Could make that into 5 sheets.
So you see how nobody's adding anything, right? This is what you just have to do to get the first number on the board.
And we have 60, which are just lines of 10. 20. And for her birthday,
Now you got to put the second number on the board.
1,000. 23. The dots represent 1.
Okay.
So now we have to add all of these together. So you could make 1,000. All of these together is 400. Now you need 600 more. So now I'm going to write the numbers down. So we have 1,000 plus, well, let's just say 3,000 because we have 3 cubes. 3,000 plus 100, 200, 300. So now we can erase all these sheets and hundreds and tens instead. So we can just add, and that gives us a total of 3,763.
Okay. That problem you just solved took about 8 minutes.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's what we're doing in
Listen
school.
to this.
But at home, I'm taught how to stack, and we're not allowed to do stacking in school. That's why we have to figure it out that way.
You are
Okay.
prohibited from doing
So I'm
stacking
going
math
to
in Common Core.
stack these numbers,
This is
which
stacking
very
math.
Easy.
If you do this in Common Core, you don't get credit for it. You have to do it their way.
What are you thinking? You're looking at your problems.
I got 2 different answers.
You got 2 different answers. What do you think happened?
Maybe I counted wrong.
Looks like you did the stacking correctly, and that took you about a minute.
So I think I did something messed up on this sheet.
What do you think happened?
Well, since that way was more confusing and it was like...
That's a smart little girl. And that clearly is a little girl who can do math. But not that way. And as Milgram points out, and I'm trying not to be glib here, because this is really not funny. But Milgram points out correctly that there is no conceivable way you ban the obvious way of doing math. I get it. Some kids may be more visual learners. I get that maybe some kids can't handle the obvious way, and if they need that extra help, you give it to them. But why are you banning, why are you prohibiting kids from doing math in the most intuitive ways? One of the things that Common Core does not allow you to do is memorize multiplication tables. It all has to be worked out this way. And it's causing a lot of problems already in young kids, particularly kids who are math capable, right? It doesn't make sense that would be like forcing somebody in English. That'd be like think about what that means. What you're doing to these kids is not let them read it the obvious way. That would be like translating all modern English into Shakespearean English and only let them read everything in Shakespearean English and not the obvious way. Not a perfect analogy. But you're making things abstract when the one thing you don't want to make things more abstract than they have to be. Make it concise. And particularly for kids at the youngest age, this is inappropriate. Little kids, they're not abstract thinkers. By the time you're in second and third grade, you can't make those kind of correspondences. Your brain doesn't work that way. And I heard the rumblings, just quick, how many of you have seen this kind of math in your school? Look at the hands, please. This is what's going on. I'm not making this up. This is what they're doing to your kids. Oh, I'm sorry. And again, don't listen to me. Go back. Don't listen to me. This is Jason Zimba. He is the architect of the Common Core math standards. He's the guy who created that. He is the main man. He had help, but he's the architect of Common Core math. David Coleman's the overseer. He's the guy most responsible for the math standards. In this short clip, you're going to hear Jason Zimba admit on film that this was not intended for STEM careers. This kind of math is not designed to help your kids become STEM ready. Science, technology, engineering, and math. He's also going to admit in this clip that the purpose of this is not to prepare your kids for college-level math either. The guy who wrote the standard. The woman interviewing him is Sandy Stotsky. You will not see her face. All right, listen to this. It's only about a 30-second clip, so I'm going to stop it a couple times and make sure we're on the same page.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique you raise. This is a minimal definition of college readiness. Where do you get the word rigor in that? Where does rigor come from? Listen to that again.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international.
That's true. It's not only not for STEM. It's also not for selective colleges that, for example.
Okay, you heard what he said, right? She criticizes it. It's not for STEM. It's not only this math, not for STEM. It's not even for selective colleges. He's going to use the example of UC Berkeley. He's going to say, if your kids want to go to UC Berkeley, they better have calculus, pre-calculus, whether they become an engineer or not. But that's disingenuous. All a selective college is any college or university that has a basic math entrance requirement, which is to say all of them. Listen to that again, and I won't stop at this time. The ending is amazing.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international.
That's true. It's not only not for STEM. It's also not for selective colleges that, for example, UC Berkeley, even whether you're going to be an engineer or not, you better have pre-calculus to get into UC Berkeley, right?
But we have to think of our engineering colleges
and that's
scientific.
That's true.
Education.
I think the third pathway goes a lot towards that. But your issue is really broader than that.
Oh yes.
So I just wanted to make sure that we got that out.
I'm not just thinking of selective colleges. There's a much broader question here.
That's right. It's both, I think.
Listen to this.
In the sense of being clear about what this college readiness does and doesn't get you, and that's the big subject.
Here.
But not to call something college ready when it only applies to a certain kind of college and a certain lower level of mathematical expertise that won't buy you far on the international market in most major disciplines of technology, economics, business, and so on.
And all he can do is shake his head yes. Go find the videos on YouTube. If you think I'm editing this video selectively, go watch it. It's even worse when you watch the whole thing. Go watch it. I'll have to send you the link. I forget what the title of it is. Oh, and I should say this too, just so we're all on the same page. When I send you the videos, the links to all my slides, the videos won't come through. I can't send them that way. They won't stay live. What I can do is when I send the videos, I can send you a YouTube list of links so you can go directly to the YouTube source and watch them, unedited. I had to edit some of them down just so this is not a 4-hour talk. So you can watch all the videos in their entirety, and every one of them you will find worse than even this. But think about this too. Does this not give the lie to your chambers of commerce? Does this not just give the lie to the chambers of commerce at the state level and the national level, who are the ones pushing this? Because they're business people, right? They have to be conservatives. So these business people, the state chambers of commerce, the national chambers of commerce, they support Common Core. But what people don't point out is two things. Number one, the National Chamber of Commerce has taken multiple millions of dollars from Gates to push this. Gates is paying for his support at the National Chamber of Commerce, number one. And number two, it's the same National Chamber of Commerce that wants amnesty and open borders. That's fine, they can do whatever they want, but how do you conclude this is a conservative organization? And why does the National Chamber of Commerce want amnesty and open borders? Because what they want is a low-skilled workforce, undereducated pool of workers to draw from who aren't going to want to become CEOs and vice presidents, who are going to stand and do the kind of work that Americans won't do. That's why they want open borders. You think the National Chamber of Commerce, right, wants to help dreamers live the American dream? It's about workers. Somebody someday, it's not going to be in my lifetime, somebody someday might shut down the southern border. And if that ever happens, we have to have an American-trained workforce to do this. You know what? The Bush kids will never have to study this stuff. The Obama kids will never have to study this stuff. Their kids won't, your kids will. It's the same principle, right? That if Obamacare is so wonderful, why did Congress exempt themselves from it? Why does everybody else have to take it, but the House, the Senate, and the President don't? Right? Shouldn't our leaders lead by example? It's the same thing here. And notice the bipartisan nature of that. You think Jeb Bush's kids are ever going to take this stuff? President Obama's kids? No, they won't. But this is what they want for your kids. It's a kind of a big deal how this math stuff works. And you don't have to listen to me. You heard David Coleman, you heard Bill Gates, you heard Jason Zimba. Before we're done, you'll hear Arnie Duncan all saying the same things, telling you exactly what the purpose of this is. This is sociology. Why in the world are you creating a math paradigm that by his admission doesn't prepare you for college and doesn't prepare you for STEM careers? Why are you doing it? Why are you banning the intuitive way of doing math from our children? Forcing them into this ridiculous paradigm. The only answer is it's sociological. One answer, Milgram says, the only answer I could ever conceive by being on that committee was they wanted to create a math paradigm that prohibited moms and dads from helping their kids. Only the schools. You created something now, whatever else it is, that most moms and dads are utterly incapable of helping their kids with. The state has to. One of the big features of Common Core, that's the sexuality stuff. Why are they sexualizing your children at younger ages? Even if you think you like the benign standard, why does the standard come with all this stuff? Because that's how they get a hold of them. If you you can't be trusted, moms and dads, anymore, to give your kids the sexual education your religious dictates demand at your own pace. You would never sexualize 5- and 6-year-olds, but they're doing it now. They're incorporating stuff into the youngest grades. They're using Common Core as a Trojan horse to mainstream things at the lowest levels, like homosexuality. Mom and dad, have whatever view of homosexuality you want. This is not an anti-gay comment. Think whatever you want to think. It's your job to educate your kids about that stuff. It's not the federal government's job to begin to mandate this now. You can't be trusted. At the very youngest ages now, they're instilling that kind of sexuality stuff in kids as a way of separating them from you. And without being overly dramatic about this, that's exactly what the Soviets used to do. They would or the Hitler Youth did. They took kids at young ages from their parents and they became solely responsible for their education, and the very first thing they did, even before all the party politic propaganda, is they sexualized them. Because as every Marxist, from Bill Ayers all the way back to Karl Marx pointed out, the single biggest barrier to statist control of education is Judeo-Christian values. You've got to unmake them. And by sexualizing children at young ages, you're breaking them down morally. That's the developmentally inappropriate stuff. And you're re-educating them, right? You're making them more libertine, right? More morally relative, more suspicious of religion, more tolerant. And what the schools mean by tolerant is you tolerate the positions of the government, not the positions of your parents or your church or your pastor, right? And so you got Jason Zimba saying it. How about this 7-year-old math problem for a 7-year-old? Tell how to make 10 when adding 8 plus 5. Little boy says you cannot make 10 when adding 8 plus 5. Even I knew that. And yet the little boy gets it marked wrong. Yes, you can. Take 2 from 5 and add it to 8. 8 plus 2 equals 10, then add 3. If you think about it long enough, you can actually make technically you can do it that way, but that's not math. What they're doing there isn't math, it's word games. It's not diversity in math. What you're doing is you're playing games with logic. It's word games, right? You cannot make 10 with 8 plus 5. That's a mathematical answer. The answer that you had to do, take 2 from 5, that's not what you were asked to do. You see the disconnect? The kid is asked a specific math problem, he gives the correct answer, and he gets it marked wrong because he tried to do math instead of word games. Take 2 from 5 and add it to 8. 8 plus 2 equals 10, and then add 3. And it's not even just the math. I told you that you go look at your kids' incoming science work. They're already filtering in the next generation standards. Watch this little ditty.
So do you understand why this is inappropriate, Audrey?
Audrey Basie just wanted to get her bio homework on DNA done when she got to a question that stumped her. It reads, the sister of the mom above also had issues with finding out who the father of her baby was. She had the state take a blood test of potential fathers. Based on the information in this table, why was the baby taken away by the state after the test? As if that question isn't tacky enough, look at the potential fathers. Bartender, guy at the club, cab driver, or flight attendant. Father Larry Basie took one look at this piece of homework and flipped.
What are they teaching? What is this? I couldn't come up with the words. I'm like, oh my God. It's teaching them that it's okay to not know who it is because you can have the state help you. And if they can't help you, they're going to take your child away. And it's not the way it is.
Were you fired up?
Oh, I was beyond fired up last night.
Flight attendant. It gives all new meaning to the words fly the friendly skies, doesn't it? It's unbelievable. Think about that. And what nobody brought up in that short news report was this, the question that I ask. Did you notice what it's a biology question that requires math. Probability is all it is, right? But the answer wasn't a probability answer. The thing that the kids had to do to get credit was, after you do the science and the math, tell why the state took the child away from the mother. What in the world does that have to do with science? That is, you're starting to see what I'm telling you? This is pure sociology. Whether you can debate me all you want about the math standard, it's better than what we have in Alabama. And go ahead. That's not the point. You don't just get the math. You get this stuff. In fact, this is the main aim of it all. And it gets even better than that. How about this for an 8-year-old? Right? Another third grade assignment. Activity. Math activity. The entire section is called Determining Fairness. Fairness in math. I didn't know math was fair or unfair. I thought math was math, right? And so notice for the 8-year-old, work with a partner. Write a ratio for each sentence. Here are the sentences, right? You pay $184 for 2 concert tickets. I pay $266 for 3 tickets. So write a ratio for each sentence. Compare the ratios. If they are equal, then you must answer it is fair. If they are not equal, then the answer it is not fair, and you have to explain your reasoning. So it's pure socialism. What business is it of theirs of what I pay for a ticket? If I want to pay $1,000 for a ticket, so what? The purpose of the assignment is not the math. You gotta do the math, and then you have to offer us. If somebody pays $1 more for 2 tickets than you did, that's not fair. That's the lesson they're meant to take away from math class, and from science class, and from English class. That's the point of this. Oh, this even gets better here, too. Wait, hold on. Justify conclusions. What information can you use to justify your conclusions about fairness? So they have to go and figure out how to justify the it is fair or the it is not fair argument. You're not going to a math source for that. You're going to a sociological one, right? All right. And then notice this in your own words. How can proportions help you decide things when things are fair? Give an example, right? You see what the objective here is. Oh, and before we even move on, is it fair? Is it fair? Is this fair? Is this fair? Think not mathematically, think in terms of social justice, right? And this is the thing that blows me away. There are over 30 school districts in the country that have already done this. This is the entire Irvine Unified School District of Orange County, California, the entire district. What happened in California is that moms and dads were starting to get nervous because by the time their kids were in 4th and 5th grade, they couldn't do adding and subtracting in their head, basically. They had not memorized their multiplication tables. The moms were getting nervous. So a bunch of Irvine moms started hiring tutors for their kids, trying to improve their math scores. The school freaked out at them, warned them and threatened them. There are variants of this on over 30 different websites now, school district websites. This one, we were out in Irvine. I did this talk in Irvine about 6 months ago, and there were 2 school board members sitting right there. They wouldn't even look at me. This is right from their own website. 1 week after I talked to them, they took it down. We've got all the screenshots to show you that it was there. And there are 30 other districts that still have it up. Here's the warning parents got. The links on this page are intended to support the classroom instruction that your child receives from his teacher. It is not appropriate to go ahead of the classroom or to use this site to have your child work on math intended for use in subsequent grades. That's the warning. Here's the threat. Your child's math instruction and math placement will not change as a result of working ahead. This means that your child will remain and continue to work in the grade level appropriate math regardless of any work that is done and turned into the teacher. Your 5-year-old your 5th grader might be ready for geography, your 8th grader might be ready for calculus, but they're gonna stay in class with their own age group doing the same stupid cubes and squares and lines. We have lost more gifted and talented education programs in this country in the last 2 years than in the last 40 years combined. Under this program, nobody gets ahead. It's not fair. It's not just. We want everybody the same, and that's not right, right? You can't read ahead. You're not going to be able to do math ahead. American schools threatening moms and dads not to help their kids get ahead. That may be the most damning thing I've showed you yet. Schools now, because it inconveniences them. It skews their paradigm. It puts them in an awkward position vis-a-vis these meaningless tests. That's not why you send your kids to school. It never, ever has been. And very quickly, I felt it compelled to do this for you. We're winding down, but you've got to see what they did to the American History, AP American History course. I told you, the same man, David Coleman, who was allowed to write the standards, is now the CEO, the president, I should say, of the college boards, where he's rewriting the SATs to conform to his standards. In his role as president of the college boards, he is now also rewriting all the advanced placement tests your kids are going to take to get into college. Your kids are in high school, they want to get AP credit. This guy, is rewriting the standards for all the AP exams. The first one they finished was American History. This is going to blow you away. It's called APUSH, Advanced Placement, U.S. History. By the way, over 400 liberal professional historians at college campuses, over 400 history professors wrote a letter to David Coleman protesting the biased nature of the history curriculum. You know what David Coleman responded? Facts don't matter in history anyway. It's in the article. Facts don't matter in history. There is rising alarm over radical changes that have been made to the Advanced Placement AP American History program, a program heavily supported by federal and state funding. That alarm flushes out another related travesty. The voice of the people has been muted because corporatists and other elites have figured out how to end-run the constitutional structure and are doing so on issue after issue. To summarize, the private college board, David Coleman's group, is rewriting the AP courses, starting with AP US History, APUSH. The new APUSH framework departs radically from traditional AP courses and now reflects a progressive philosophy and leftist bias. Forget the Founding Fathers and the principles of the Declaration of Independence that proclaim the natural right of freedom and self-government. Concentrate instead on the racist cultural imperialism that supposedly built America. Ignore state history standards, all or most of which were fact-based, and that's true. You had Alabama state history standards before this for the AP. They were really quite balanced. Not anymore. All the states have given in and taken this because you want to get your kid college credit, they're the ones giving the test. You're going to have to take their test, right? Here's the professors. To objections that students will learn an inaccurate version of American history, the College Board responded that facts aren't all that important anyway. What's important are historical thinking skills, such as contextualization and crafting historical arguments. Don't teach kids the founding facts, the facts of the nation. Teach them narratives. We are an imperial country. We are a sexist country. We're a homophobic country. We're a bigoted country. Right? Teach them narratives, not facts. This progressive education nonsense will produce historically illiterate students, not informed citizens, so said the college professors who objected. Just a couple examples. This is the Common Core, this is the AP, history exam. AP history exam. It's not technically Common Core because it's the College Board. But think about this. If this is the way the AP is requiring history be taught, what do you think history in your schools will look like in 5 years? The section on George Washington. George Washington gets 2 paragraphs in the book. 2 paragraphs George Washington gets. Bill Clinton gets 60 pages. 2 paragraphs. Here's what they say about George Washington. Although he dressed in plain American broadcloth at his inauguration and claimed to be content with a plain Republican title, Washington was counted among the nationalists. He was anything but a man of the people. By nature reserved and solemn, he chose to ride about town in a grand carriage drawn by 6 horses and escorted by uniformed liverymen. In the tradition of British royalty, he delivered his addresses personally to Congress and received from both houses a reply. Not a single mention that George Washington, was offered a crown and turned it down. Just that he was no man of the people, he was a royalist. Right? How about this? The part on Reagan kills me. Reagan gets a couple paragraphs too. Right? Right before Clinton, Reagan gets 2 paragraphs. Clinton gets 60 pages. And again, whatever your politics are, I would not want this reversed. It wouldn't be any better. But notice what it says about Reagan, the opening sentence. President Ronald Reagan, a charismatic figure who sometimes invented his own past and seemed to believe in it, offered remedies for a weary and nostalgic nation. Right? So Reagan is a liar and made up his own history. Right? That's what it says. And then there's this. This is the bulk of the Reagan paragraph. Are you ready? This is the bulk of what your kids will learn about the Reagan administration. Everything about Reagan's inauguration reflected what Nancy Reagan described as her aspiration to put the White House, quote, symbolically back upon a hill in people's minds, to have stature and loftiness, unquote. The Reagans hired a public relations expert to ensure that every event was telecast. All the inaugural balls, concerts, and receptions were planned to entertain and astound at-home audiences. Festivities at the Washington, D.C. balls were also beamed through a $2 million satellite hookup to mini balls held simultaneously across the nation. Reagan's inauguration, touted by the press as the most expensive in U.S. history, showcased the theme the president-elect had chosen: America, a new beginning. Not the belt-tightening, homespun ways of the Carter presidency, noticed one reporter, but an unabashed celebration of wealth would prevail. Right? This is what they're getting. This is how they're going to have to answer on those tests. This is what it's constructed to. Right? And the textbook that the College Board put together even warns teachers in the preface how to handle angry conservatives. Here's a paragraph, right? A whole section in the book devoted to muting and making an end run around anybody who objects from the right. Teachers considering the purchase of Out of Many should be aware, however, that the book has become part of the textbook culture wars. Conservatives who want democracy and free enterprise presented more favorably are bothered by what they see as left-leaning texts that pay too much attention to the dark side of American history, as well as subjects that are not deemed suitable for high school students, including homosexuality and prostitution. The textbook has they spend more time talking about the history of prostitution in America and how it was ultimately a good thing than they talk about the Founding Fathers. And because you object to that, you should know, teachers, that you right-wingers, right, that you don't want your kids to learn the history of prostitution. Shame on you, right? You're not progressive enough. Consequently, out of many has come under scrutiny, especially where state boards of education have the power to select and reject texts. And what they go on explicitly to argue is that we should take power away from the states to select the textbooks that their kids read. That the argument is that as long as states get to pick, they won't pick this book. And your kids need to be reading this book. So maybe the time has come to consider not allowing states to have any authority over the textbooks that their kids read. But then again, that's kind of Common Core, isn't it, when you think about it? And then I only have a moment or two on the data mining. It's a huge, complicated issue. We can certainly address it a little bit in the question and answer if you want. I'll simply point out that this is the federal government built this in Utah, in a Utah desert. This is the huge facility in Bluffdale, Utah, where they're going to house all your kids' data, medical data, educational data. That's it in the Utah desert. So annoyed with this are the people of Utah that they are trying to craft legislation that would cut off the water to the building. And that's a big deal because the most environmentally conscious administration in human history built that in the middle of a desert where it requires 4 million gallons of water a day just to cool the computers in a desert. Right? And you understand, too, when you link up with the Affordable Care Act, and I've got the slides. I don't have time to, I'll send them to you when you ask for the presentation. I've got all sorts of slides taken right from the Affordable Care Act that empower the schools to become medical gathering and informational gathering entities on your kids. That's the data mining. Now that the government's in control of healthcare, everything is healthcare. Guns are a healthcare issue. What your kids eat at lunch, Michelle Obama's lunch plan, right, to change, that's healthcare. Everything that goes on in your schools now is healthcare. And all that data gets stored here. Just take a look at this. This is just the federal government. Notice the date here. 2 months ago, December 2014. These are all the federal agencies that get every bit of educational information on your kids. All their test scores, all their evaluations. It goes to all those different, as of 2 months ago, each of those federal organizations gets all the data they collect on your kids and your families. Things like the Administration for Children and Families, the Administration for Community Living, Agency for Healthcare Research, Centers for Disease Control, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Defense gets your kids' educational records, the Department of Education, the Bureau of Prisons, the Department of Labor, the Department of Veteran Affairs, Federal Communications Commission. Right? I love it. The Department of Indian Affairs gets all your kids' records. The Health and Human Service Secretary, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, the National Science Foundation, Networking and Information the Networking and Information Technology people, Research and Development gets it, the Office of Personnel Management, the Social Security Administration, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Agency. That's just at the federal level, where all this information, they're using your schools to gather. And by the way, go look at your Race to the Top application. Every state that signed any Race to the Top agreement also signed on to sharing certain data points with the federal government. Simply by virtue of taking money, your state signed on to mandatory agreement that you're going to turn over. Your state will turn over certain educational points to the federal government every year. It's unbelievable. Listen to Arnie, we're almost done now. Listen to Arnie Duncan on the Charlie Rose Show in 2009.
I think our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day. So it's not just lengthening.
So 8 to 8 or something like that?
At home, we attached healthcare clinics to about 24 of our schools. Where schools truly become the centers of the community, great things happen. And this is a chance to really create what I think the 21st century school has to look like. This needs to be the norm, not the exception. Time matters tremendously, and all of our families need our doors open longer.
Is this a big ticket item in terms of financial resources?
Finances is a piece of this, and we again have significant financial resources, unprecedented financial resources coming to the table. But let me be clear, this is thinking differently and being creative.
Do you hear what he said? Schools should be open 12, 13 hours a day. We are attaching healthcare clinics to our new schools, right? Why are they doing that? Because under the health care law, the Affordable Care Act, the schools are able to offer your kids birth control, including the morning after abortion pill, even take your children off campus if they request it and give them abortions. So the schools are now empowered to do that. But it's hard, right? With taking a kid off campus, driving her to a doctor's office is difficult. They're building healthcare clinics on new schools now because all that will be handled in-house. That if a 13-year-old girl comes to a teacher or goes to a school nurse and asks for a certain kind of birth control, it will be provided for them, and you will never know it was given to them. Children under the age of 16 will be provided those services, paid for by the government, and you do not have to be consulted about them. Their schools open 12, 13 hours a day, right? Did you hear his Freudian slip? Our stores, he called them. When schools become the centers of the community, right? In other words, your kids are going to be basically staying, if this gets its way, your kids are just going to be bed and breakfasting at your house, right? In Green Bay, in Wisconsin, won a grant last year to provide, get this, Green Bay already provides breakfast, lunch, and dinner for every single kid in the school district, every day, because they determined it was unfair and it was not socially just only to provide free breakfast, lunch, and dinner to kids who needed it. So even the rich kids have to get it now in the interest of social justice. If you're going to offer it to the poor kids who can't feed themselves, you have to offer it to all kids. So that wasn't enough. As the Green Bay district argued, when our kids go home for summer break, they're going to starve to death because, Mom and Dad, you don't know how to feed your kids. And we've been feeding them breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 9 months. They won a grant from the Obama administration to offer free breakfast, lunch, and dinner to every school kid in Green Bay all summer long. They can show up for. Right? So you're not feeding them, right? The schools are feeding them for you. Schools are changing their diets. They don't think you should, and that you have the right to look after your kids. Because if you do it, if you're looking after your kids won't be the same kid. Your kids won't always eat the things the government wants them to eat, and God knows they won't believe the things they want them to believe with regards to sex, sexuality, the nature of the state. Everything I've told you has documented by somebody else. For the first time today, I'm going to offer you my 2 cents. Here's what I think Common Core is. Right? I've never heard anybody else say this, so you can blame me for this one. For the last 40, 50 years, our kids have been learning their ABCs and their 1, 2, 3s. But as they've been getting them over the last 30, 40, 50 years, they've been pushed politically left. I don't think that's even deniable. Right? That our kids have been getting a steady dose of, for lack of a better word, political correct ways of seeing things. I think for the first time, Common Core represents a flip. Now, the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s are actually subordinated to the politics. I think the purpose of Common Core is first and foremost sociology. They flipped that now. It doesn't matter if it's going to work or not. I don't think well, Jason Zimba told you, this is not designed to make your kid engineers or architects or doctors. Our math is not designed to get them ready for a rigorous college math program. It's designed for something sociological. That's the big shift here. So the debates about the standards, I think, are absolutely meaningless. They don't tell us a thing, because that's never been what this is about. And to make my final point, this is Dr. Mary Calamia. She is a clinical psychologist and a child development specialist. She's from New York. And New York's one of those states that had 2 years of testing already. And here she is testifying before the Senate Select Committee in New York on Common Core. And what is a private psychiatrist and doctor started happening with kids when they put the Common Core and the tests into the state. It's compelling. Maybe when you see this, you'll understand why Progressive New York and the teachers' unions of New York, they're really trying to get out of this now. Listen to what Dr. Mary testified.
Good afternoon. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm a psychotherapist. I work with parents, children, and about half of my caseload is teachers also. My caseload represents about 20 different school districts in Suffolk County. In the fall of 2012, my phone started ringing. I started getting an inordinate number of referrals of students, a lot of honors students, 8th graders mostly, who were self-mutilating. They were cutting themselves with sharp objects, and they were burning themselves with cigarettes. My phone never stopped. And I didn't know why. I asked the kids, and all they kept saying was, "We can't take the pressure, it's too much." I also started getting a lot of elementary school students referred to me. They were refusing to go to school. They said they felt stupid and that school was too hard. They were throwing tantrums, begging to stay home, and upset to the point of vomiting. I was hearing from parents about kids bringing home homework they couldn't help them with. I was alarmed to hear that in some cases there were no textbooks for the parents to look at, and they had no idea what their children were learning. The teachers were reporting a staggering level of anxiety and depression, and that was when I first heard the term Common Core and learned about the standards that we now say set the bar so high anyone can walk right under it. Everyone was talking about the tests. As the school year progressed and the tests loomed, my patients were increasing their self-mutilating behaviors. They were complaining of insomnia, panic attacks, loss of appetite, depressed mood, and in one case, suicidal thoughts that resulted in a 2-week hospital stay for an adolescent. We can't regulate biology. Young children cannot engage in the type of critical thinking that the Common Core calls for. That would require a fully developed prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that is not fully functional until adulthood. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for critical thinking, rational decision-making, and abstract thought, all things that the Common Core requires prematurely. We give children pre-assessments, tell them to succeed, and then give them tests on material they haven't learned and tell them it's okay to fail. They cannot resolve that mixed message. Last spring, a 6-year-old encountered a multiplication sign on the NWEA first grade math exam and asked the teacher what it was. The teacher was not allowed to help him and told him to just do his best. From that point on, the student's test performance went downhill. He couldn't shake off the unfamiliar symbol and couldn't believe his teacher wouldn't help him. The Common Core requires children to read informational texts that are owned by a handful of corporations. They don't have a filter to distinguish good information from bad. So whatever you put in front of them, they take that as gospel. They're literal. So when we give them a textbook that explains the Second Amendment as the people have the right to keep and bear arms in a state militia, they will look no further for clarification. We ask them to write critically using emotionally charged language to persuade instead of inform. They don't have that functional prefrontal cortex. So they tap into their limbic system, which is the part of the brain that involves basic human emotions, anger and fear being the foremost. So when we ask them to use emotionally charged language, we're actually asking them to fuel their language with fear and anger and aggression. They cannot temper this judgment. They don't have the ability to do that. So we teach to the test, which I think doesn't really measure learning. I think the tests measure endurance and resilience. Only a child who can sit still for 90 minutes, come back the next day and do it again, and the next day again, can succeed. I'm going to introduce you to a couple, I'm almost done. I'm going to introduce you just a couple of student stories, okay? A couple of the faces of the Common Core. We have an entire 3rd grade class that spent the entire day sobbing after one testing session. A 2nd grader who witnessed this is now in 3rd grade and won't go to school. She's being evaluated, a 7-year-old being evaluated for psychotropic medication just to get her to go to school. A 6-year-old who came home crying because in September, in the 1st grade, she didn't know what a vertex was. 2 8-year-olds opted out of the ELA exam and were publicly denied cookies because the teacher gave them to the class but wouldn't give them to them. And that teacher, who under duress, felt obligated to do such a thing. A 6th grader who once aspired to be a writer but now won't do it because we do it all day long, even in math. And a mother who has to leave work early because her son is hysterical over his math homework, and his CPA grandfather who's babysitting for him can't even help him do it. And countless other kids who are refusing to go to school, feel stupid, and now are completely turned off to education. I will conclude with this one thought. Our country became a superpower on the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses. This isn't rocket science. It doesn't take a great deal of technology or corporate or government involvement to help our children to succeed. We need to rethink the Common Core and the associated high-stakes testing and get back to the business of educating our children in a safe, healthy, and productive manner. Thank you.
And I leave you with this. I saved this till the very end. This is the second half of the Common Core copyright. I didn't show you at the beginning. This is what else it says. I've run this past a dozen lawyers, and they all agree. This isn't just standard legalese. If all this is a set of standards, as we're told, it's an innocent set of standards, why in the world did the Common Core people go to this trouble to indemnify themselves from psychological trauma and harm? Here's what it reads. Under no circumstance shall the NGA Center or the CCSSO, individually or jointly, be liable for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, exemplary, consequential, or punitive damages, however caused, and on any legal theory of liability, whether for contract, tort, strict liability, or a combination, arising in any way out of the use of the Common Core state standards, even if we are advised of the possibility of such risks and potential damage. Even if you tell us it's hurting your kids, even if you tell us it's damaging them, you still can't sue us for them. Without limiting the foregoing, the licensee waives the right to seek, you by taking this, your state, waives the right to seek legal redress against and releases from all liability the people who wrote it. If this is what your schools tell you, just an innocent set of standards, you don't do that. These are people who know exactly what they're doing, from beginning to end and from top to bottom across the board. And I'm done, but you got to ask yourself that question, right? Why are you doing this? Why are your politicians doing this? And I no longer buy the argument that they don't know what Common Core is. I no longer buy the argument that they're ignorant. There's obviously a quid pro quo here, right? So you now know, but again, this is all meaningless. What are you going to do about it? And we're going to have a panel to help you discuss that. But I thank you immensely for taking the time to listen to this today. I appreciate it. That's the email address. I gave all my business cards away. You want to go to that email address, fpeusa.org. I will send you all of this information free of charge. No fee whatsoever. And I will also, if you remind me, I may forget, I'll send the link where the videos are too. So ask me and you can have them. So all this information is yours to do with what you will.